My neck is off, so I have to. It's weird. I don't know what it's looking for. Here we go. Seven discoveries. Over the next few days, although he continued to show up for lessons in the secret library, Will refused to jump into the book world. He just sat there and stared down at his desk while Glenn bored us with speeches about the history of Stormsay and the feud between our families. When the theoretical part of our training was over, Will would disappear so fast that I didn't even get a chance to ask him how he was. And in the afternoons I couldn't find him anywhere on the island. But something had changed between us since that evening in his cottage. Sometimes when nobody was watching, he looked up from his desk and shot me a glance as if to say we understood each other. I was worried about him, of course, and was everybody else on the island. But I also realized that he needed some time. Will had barricaded himself away in a shell of guilt and self-doubt. And it would take a while for him to emerge again. I knew what it felt like to lose a friend. For that reason, I decided to give him some space for a while and focus my energies on the book world instead. I was still so intrigued by the book world that I just couldn't get enough of it. The brief jumps we did in our morning lessons weren't nearly enough to satisfy my curiosity. I usually jumped again in the afternoon from my bedroom, in secret of course, so that it wouldn't occur to anybody to ban my unsupervised excursions. Since Sherlock's death, however, these excursions had not been quite as carefree as before. Everybody seemed by now to think that he had fallen off the cliffs during the storm, but I had a strange feeling about the whole thing, especially when I thought about the hole in his chest. Something about it wasn't right, and I got the impression, although we never spoke about it, that Will felt the same way, but I was even more puzzled by what I had found in the book world that Sunday morning. Werther and I had just been admiring Dorothy's silver shoes in The Wizard of Oz, and were sitting together in a little nook of the ink pot when a swarm of fairies came buzzing in through an open window. The little creatures were barely as long as my thumb. Their leathery blue skin was stretched tightly over their bony faces, and their wings were like dragonflies' wings. The swarm flew over the bar, and the fairies' tiny voices came together in a buzzing chorus as they ordered a glass of flower nectar. The cloud of blue bodies then arranged itself into the shape of a hand which closed around the goblet of golden liquid and picked it up. They set the drink down on the table next to ours and began to dive into it head first, one after the other, smacking their lips loudly. Werther shook himself. Ugh, he said. Fairies have no manners. He leaned forward to sip from the straw in his bottle of cola. This was his new favorite drink, having, unlike ink cocktails, no disagreeable side effects. In his hand he held a stately quill pen with which he was scratching something on a sheet of handmade paper. Werther loved writing letters to other characters. This one was addressed to a good friend of his named Wilhelm, and in it Werther described in florid language how he had recently gotten drunk out of sheer existential despair. The way he told it, it had been an almost heroic act. From across the table I read in Werther's ornate handwriting something about an unquiet soul and afflictions of the heart. You had to hand it to him. The man was good with words. But the lip-smacking fairies at the next table seemed to be shifting his creativity. The quill hovered in the air for a moment above the half-finished letter, and then he set it aside and sighed. Vexatious creatures, he murmured. They stick their pointed noses into everything imaginable and go flying about in stories where they have no business to be for the sheer amusement of it. Well, we do that too, I reminded him gently as the fairies, as the next table began a competition to see who could perform the best dive bomb into the flower nectar. Werther massaged the bridge of his nose. Indeed, he said, but we, unlike them, know how to behave. He rolled up his letter to keep it dry, since we were now getting splashed with nectar. I brushed a glistening droplet from my cheek and felt as though I'd put my hand in superglue. My index finger immediately stuck fast to my chin. Maybe so, I said, trying discreetly to free myself. Inquisitive beast, he grumbled Werther. My index finger wouldn't budge. The fairies, meanwhile, had emptied their goblet and were now lolling around on the table with full bellies. A couple of them belched heartily. I thought for a moment. So they go flying around all over the place, did you say? Werther nodded. A veritable plague. Nobody in the book world with an ounce of self-respect will have anything to do with them. I will, I resolved, standing up. Excuse me, may I sit with you for a moment? I asked one of the belching fairies. The fairy opened its bright green eyes wide with surprise and squeaked something I couldn't understand. Pardon? I asked. I used my non-glued hand to pull up a chair. The fairy sat upright, and the rest of the swarm perked up too and started buzzing. Why? The fairy in front of me repeated, and her fellow fairies hissed an echo of her words. Are you holding your chin? My finger stuck. I tugged at the finger again, to no avail. Ah, said the fairy chorus. I wanted to ask whether I stammered, distracted by one of the fairies as it flew close to my face, rings whirring. A moment later, I felt its needle-sharp teeth sink into my fingertip. Ow! I shook the fairy off, and it landed with a bump on the tabletop. Sorry, it mumbled, rubbing its head. Just trying to help. I frowned. By biting my finger off? Only the nectar, chirruped another fairy, landing on my wrist. Its wings tickled my cheek as it bent down and started gnawing at the gluey droplet. The other fairies looked on sulkily. So, what I was wondering was, have you happened to notice anything strange recently on your travels around the book world? I said in a rush. Humph, grunted the fairy on my wrist. The rest of the swarm shot up into the air in front of me. A myriad of glowing green eyes fixed themselves on my face. Yes, they buzzed in chorus. Bad things are happening. Terrible things. Somebody is on the prowl. Somebody is stealing them. Somebody wicked. I thought of the white rabbit in Alice in Wonderland who had lost his watch, his waistcoat, and his ability to talk. You mean more ideas have been stolen? The fairies nodded vehemently, and the hum of their wings swelled to a drone as they flew closer to me. I felt an icy draft on my face. Sleeping Beauty is woken up halfway through her 100-year sleep and refuses to wait for her prince, they whispered. Dorian Gray has lost his picture. The Elf King has vanished. It gets worse by the day. More and more ideas are disappearing, and not just any ideas. At last the fairy nibbled on my finger, freeing my face. Thanks. I waggled my hand about a bit. But what do you mean, not just any ideas? The fundamental ideas, whispered the fairies even more softly. Their words hissed in my ears. Their core ingredients, the author's initial ideas, without which a story simply breaks down. Somebody is sneaking around the book world, stealing them. Werther and I sat talking in our nook for a long time after the fairies had left the ink pot. What did the thief want with all these ideas? How was he or she managing to steal them? And who was the thief? And could whoever it was be stopped? But our reflections on the subject went round and round in circles when we couldn't find a satisfactory answer to any of our questions. After a while we gave up. Werther headed back to the plot of his story to commit suicide, and I returned to the outside world, where the weather soon took my mind off the thief. The afternoon had brought blazing sunshine to the island, and the temperature had reached almost summery heights. I spread out a blanket on the grounds of Linnet's house and lay down on my back, gazing up at the blue sky above me and marveling at how high and clear it was. My skin drank in every sunbeam, and I was reveling in the warmth on my shoulders and my feet when suddenly I heard footsteps. At first I thought it was one of the sheep wandering over in search of a fresher and juicier grass, but then a mop of dark hair appeared in the cloudless sky. It was followed by Will's face. There were dark shadows under his eyes. Hi, he said uncertainly. I sat up. Hi. I was going to go down to the beach and have another look at that place where we got washed up. I thought I might find some kind of a trace, some clue as to what happened. He swallowed and held out his hand to me. Will you come with me? So this was it, the first timid feeler to emerge from Will's shell. I knew it. I smiled tentatively so as not to frighten him straight back in, and let him help me up. As he did so, Will's hand held mine to touch longer than was strictly necessary, and suddenly Storm's Eye seemed even more radiant than before. The sunshine painted bright patterns on the sleeves of my shirt and made the colors of the wildflowers on the moor even more vivid. Only Will looked gray and gloomy, as if he were standing under his own personal rain cloud. We headed down the path that led to the beach. Have you searched the cliffs too, or if he did fall into the sea from there? Then there might be the other, I began. Yes, I have, said Will. His eyes were glued to the shipwreck in the distance. To our right, the waves washed gently over the shingle and broken seashells. We tramped along the beach until we were approaching the remains of the submarine fleet. All of a sudden, there was a sharp intake of breath from Will beside me. Are you okay? I asked. He pointed mutely to a shadow in between the metal ribs that looked horribly like a human body. I gasped. Though I wasn't cold, I started shivering and my legs felt funny, as if they didn't belong to me. They carried me toward the wreckage as if of their own accord, as I was being pulled by an invisible string inexorably toward something horrific, like in your dream when you want to run away but can't. The closer we got, the more clearly we could see the human shoulders jutting out of the water. They were draped in a flowery tunic, and above the tunic was a mop of dripping dark red hair. My stomach lurched. All of a sudden there was a complete silence in my head. I ran into the waves. Alexis, I tried to scream, but all that came out of my mouth was a hoarse croak. I tripped over a sharp piece of metal and fell headfirst into the water. When I resurfaced, I found myself looking straight into Alexis's astonished face. She wasn't dead, of course she wasn't. Relief flooded through me, until I realized my mom wasn't alone. There were two arms around her waist, hugging her tightly. Alexis was nestled against the chest of a man with a scarred face. It was a very young face, and it belonged to Desmond. I stared from one to the other, open-mouthed. They were both dripping wet, and their cheeks were flushed. Their clothes clung to their bodies. It looked like they'd come out here into the shallow water to swim and make out. "Hello, Amy," mumbled Alexis, hastily trying to button up her blouse. I made a gurgling noise. Grinning, Desmond plucked a shell out of Alexis's hair. His eyes shone when he looked at her. How old was the guy? 20? 19? 18? My mouth opened and closed again. "Amy, I can explain," said Alexis. She was still nestled in close to this boy. At last I regained control of my legs. I turned and ran. Water flew up around me and splashed into my eyes. I stumbled ashore, slipped on the shingle, and fell forward onto my hands and knees. I picked myself straight back up and lurched onward. I had to get away from here, far away. Alexis shouted something after me. Will's voice drifted over to me, too. Then Desmond's. I didn't hear a word. The blood was roaring in my ears, drowning out every other sound. I was startled, therefore, to suddenly feel a hand on my shoulder. Will was jogging alongside me. "I think you misunderstood," he panted. "Oh, really?" I spat. There wasn't much to misunderstand, after all. I can put two and two together. Alexis has obviously got over her broken heart. I'm happy for her. I broke free of his grasp and scrambled up a sand dune. Will didn't follow me. I ran blindly onto the moor, wishing I could retreat into my own shell now. For a long time I roamed across the wild moorland. Thorns clawed at the legs of my jeans, and a crust of mud formed around the soles of my chucks. My thoughts had knotted themselves together into a kind of fireball inside my head, and all the stories I'd ever read hung like dead weights from my feet. Stories about heroes, stories about people who are exactly the opposite. Stories about love, stories about war, exciting stories, comforting stories, sad stories. They clung to me and whispered to me how life should and shouldn't be. To me, Alexis had always been one of the heroes. She was my role model, and the mom who looked after me, the best friend who I could talk to about absolutely anything. But now dark blotches marred my bright, shining image of her. Today I'd seen a different Alexis, an Alexis who had feelings for a boy not much older than me, an Alexis who seemed to have completely forgotten her love for Dominic in the space of a few days. This was an Alexis I didn't know. I was starting to get a stitch, but I still ran on. Sweat trickled down my temples. I was completely out of breath, but still I ran. At first it was anger that drove me, then shame at the thought of this incongruous romance. But I wasn't really ashamed of Alexis, and I wasn't angry either. More than anything, the feeling that weighed heavy on my chest, threatening to suffocate me, was disappointment. It was the realization that Alexis had drifted away from me, that she didn't understand me anymore. A few days on Stormsay had been enough to create a rift between us. I arrived back at Lennox's house just in time for dinner. I sat down, mud and all, at the table where Lady Merritt and Alexis were already seated. Alexis had a dry dress on and a big felt flower in her hair. My grandmother raised her eyebrows at the sight of me. "I fell over," I muttered with a shrug. Alexis quickly steered the conversation around to the flower arrangement in the middle of the table. After a while, Mr. Stevens came in with a large silver platter, and with the air of a man taking his life in his hands, presented us with a joint of tofu he had marinated in the oven with onions and carrots. It was accompanied by vegan mashed potatoes and green beans and tasted amazing. Without saying a word, I wolfed down as much as I possibly could and disappeared upstairs, where I showered and got into bed. A little while later, when the door creaked open and I felt Alexis sit down on the edge of my bed, I pretended to be asleep. The next morning, Glenn came into the classroom looking grave. "I must remind you," he said, "that it is forbidden for book jumpers to jump into the book world outside of lessons until their training is complete. That is one of the most important rules of all. Have you learned nothing from what happened to Holmes?" The usually friendly twinkle in his eye had vanished. He looked hard at each of us in turn. I gnawed at my lower lip. Had Werther and I messed something up in the book world? I cast my mind back to the last couple of expeditions. We'd been in the Wizard of Oz, and before that in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But both times we'd been very careful and remained in our explorations. Had we made any stupid mistake? Glenn pursed his lips. He seemed to take the fact that somebody had broken the rules again as a personal insult. Part of me felt bad because, of course, I knew the rule and yet I persisted in breaking it, but another part of me felt that it was impossible only to visit the book world for half an hour a day under Glenn's supervision. The temptation was just too strong. So what's gone wrong? I asked. Nothing yet, he said sharply. But the mere fact that Desmond saw one of you up at the Porto Literae last night is very worrying. A careless jump could lead to goodness knows what, potentially something even worse than the death of a protagonist. Had I heard right? There is somebody at the stone circle? I mumbled. Was Glenn not referring to my little escapades from the four-poster bed after all? He nodded sternly. Where else? This somebody had their hood up and was sneaking about on the hilltop. Desmond was coming back from a nighttime walk, and he spotted the glimmer of a book from which a book jumper must have just emerged. But by the time he reached the portal, whoever it was had disappeared. So which of you was it? I swallowed hard, mainly because I had a pretty good idea who Desmond had been visiting on his nighttime walk. Glenn was waiting for an answer. His gaze bored into mine, then slid to Will and then to Betsy, who gave an indignant sniff. Jumping in secret is so irresponsible, she said. Obviously, after so many years of training, I know I could do it without causing chaos in the book world at the first opportunity, but I would never take such a risk, and I think you know that. The corners of Glenn's mouth twitched. Betsy took this as an agreement and went on. And anyway, it's pretty obvious who it must have been. Given that Will isn't jumping at all anymore, there's only one other person it could have been, someone inexperienced and naive enough to go sneaking into books at night. I turned to face her. Someone who doesn't give a crap about Stormsay and our family traditions. Someone who doesn't have the true book jumper blood of McAllister's running through their veins, Bessie went on. What do you mean? I'd never go to the stone circle at night to jump, I said, and in my head I added, because I don't need the stone circle to get to the book world. Are you and Desmond sure this person was using the portal? Will put in. We are, said Glenn. Perhaps there's another book jumper that we don't know about, a distant relative or something? I mused aloud. Perhaps that person is the thief as well. Thief? Inquired Glenn. What's thief? I told him about the strange goings-on in the book world, and the fairies' theory that somebody was stealing the core ingredients of stories, to be on the safe side, not wanting to arouse Glenn's wrath by telling him about my unauthorized excursions. I made out that the fairies had just popped into the Jungle Book recently, but by the time I'd finished, Glenn, Betsy, and even Will looked more amused than alarmed. You do know you can't trust fairies, don't you? They probably just made it up as a prank, said Will. But they saw it with their own eyes. The White Rabbit from Alice in Wonderland can't talk anymore, and it's not as if Alice in Wonderland is full of crazies that like to play tricks on people, Betsy interrupted with an affected little laugh. At any rate, you do not seem to be doing what you were supposed to be doing, which is concentrating on the Jungle Book, Glenn remarked. I cannot condone that. Do you not think you need any training? I looked down at my desk. It's not that, but the book world and what the other characters have to say is so exciting. I think we can all understand that sentiment, but from now on you must do as you are told and focus on the characters from your own story. Do you understand? Glenn looked a little friendlier now. Yes, I said. So it is not even a possibility that there might be other book jumpers out there we just don't know about yet? Glenn shook his head. Who else could there be? This island is tiny. We'd know if somebody new arrived, wouldn't we? An hour later, Glenn issued us detailed instructions for our jumps and sent us off to the portal, but no sooner had we left the classroom than I almost collided with Desmond, who came careening around a corner with a pile of heavy books. He managed to pull up just in time, but the tower of books he was carrying started swaying dangerously, and he had to weave to and fro for a few seconds to steady them. Amy, he exclaimed, could I talk to you for a moment? I looked at his scarred cheeks and the freckles on his nose. His gray eyes shone through the haze of dancing dust motes that filled every corner of these underground passageways. For all intents and purposes, he seemed like a nice guy, but under the present circumstances. I don't see what we could have to talk about, I said, lifting my chin. See, he thinks it was Amy, too, Betsy whispered to Will. The two of them were walking behind me. I left Desmond standing there with his pile of books, his shoulders sagging as he threw a helpless glance at Will, and marched on toward the exit, just as I was wondering whether Betsy was telling the truth about never having jumped in secret when she seemed to think she was by far the best of the three of us. Will dragged me without warning into a gap between two shelves. You go on ahead, he called to Betsy, drawing me deeper into the dusty thicket of the library. He finally came to a stop in a corner between some frayed rolls of parchment and a weird painted globe. Look, Amy, I know this sounds weird, but Desmond is older than he looks, okay? He whispered, suddenly so close to me that the smell of moorlanded soap filled my nostrils. Will spoke quickly, as if that would make what he had to say less implausible. He's not a real person. He's a book character. So are Glenn and Clyde. All three of them have been living here in the library for nearly 300 years. Our clans rescued them from the burning manuscript. They're book characters? I stammered. They seem so real and everything. Will pulled one of the scrolls from the shelf behind me and unrolled it carefully. Where do you think they got these burn scars from? I remembered how sad Glenn had looked when he told me about the fairy tale that had caught fire. So that had been his home. No wonder he found it difficult to talk about. Can't they go back? Will's fingertips glided over the text. No, because their story was destroyed. They're trapped forever in the outside world. Oh, I said, and now I too ran my fingers over the porous parchment. It was weird how valuable a scrap of paper like this with a few symbols on it could be. I didn't think book characters could live in the outside world permanently. They don't normally, but they can, though they never feel properly at home outside the book world because they're different, and I always will be. It always will be. You don't notice it at first glance, but they're stronger than us, for example, and they don't sleep. Every 100 years or so, they have a kind of nap for a few years, and then they're ready to go again. Oh, yeah, and they don't age. Will looked me straight in the eye. His thumb brushed the back of my hand with a shiver ran through me. A lovely shiver. I looked down embarrassed. Desmond only looks young from the outside. So if your mom does want to be with him, there's no. I let go of the parchment and pushed past Will. That's no excuse, I said. She went behind my back and basically threw herself at the nearest guy she could find, okay? The whole reason we came here was because she got her heart broken. Dominic literally just broke up with her, and she was devastated by it, but now she seems to have completely forgotten about that all of a sudden, and I don't really understand what's going on with her. I couldn't help it. Tears welled up in my eyes. I blinked furiously at the ceiling. That's why you came back to Stormside? Asked Will. I nodded. Alexis was so down about Dominic, and my mouth went dry. I needed to get away from it all, too, have a change of scene. That's easy to do when you're a book jumper. Will rolled the ancient parchment up again and placed it back on the shelf. He gazed at it a moment longer, then took a deep breath. Don't get me wrong, I think book jumping is a very good way to distract yourself when you're feeling sad, he began, and it sounded as though he'd been planning for days what he was going to say. But do me a favor and be careful. It's easy to underestimate how much damage you can do. I learned that the hard way. I said, I'll be careful. That's what I thought, and now Sherlock's dead. I won't bring any characters to the outside world, don't worry, I reassured him. All I want is to have a look around their stories. I couldn't suppress a grin. To be honest, I've been to a few other stories, as well as the Jungle Book and Oliver Twist. This really is the best thing that's ever happened to me. Will's face remained solemn. And what if you do end up disrupting something, he asked. What if the White Rabbit has lost his voice because of you? So you do believe me? That there's something going on in the book world, that somebody's stealing the ideas. No, I don't, but I do worry that you're not taking your gifts seriously enough. Rubbish, I said. I'm just doing a bit of exploring. I know exactly what I'm doing. You mean sneaking into books at night. He suspected me. I folded my arms. And what if I was? I sniffed. Just because you made a mistake, that doesn't give you the right to judge me. And just because you suddenly think it's wrong doesn't mean we all have to stop jumping. I glared at him. That's what you want, isn't it? You'd prefer it if me and Betsy stayed out of the book world, too. Will shrugged. At least that way we could be sure nobody else would die. Sure, I said, but I'm not going to give up the book world just because you're feeling guilty. It's too amazing. I wouldn't give it up, ever. Will nodded jerkily. I get it, he snapped. Just wait till you do something stupid and destroy a story, then. I won't warn you again. Is that a promise? He turned and stomped off without another word. The dagger's blade was cold as silver, and it was sharp. It seemed to slice through the moonlight that glanced off its surface. The knight reached for the jewel-studded hilt, and molded itself to his hand, as if the dagger had been forged especially for him, as if it were part of him, a part of his body, long believed lost, and now returned to him. I thank you, said the knight. His eyes still rested upon the weapon. The princess closed the velvet-lined casket and replaced it on her dainty little dresser. Kill it, she whispered. Um, I'm going to go really quickly downstairs. Get something to drink. 8. A change in the weather. Now how the winds soar and they rush and they whirl, sighed Werther, looking out at the wet fields and the swaying trees and the edge of the wood. Rain came pelting down on us. It was dark and we were standing somewhere in the fictional version of a 19th century British shire. The downpour had left me and Werther soaked to the skin. The downpour had left me and Werther soaked to the skin. Within seconds, my sweater had been completely saturated with rainwater and now hung heavy on my shoulders. Werther's linen shirt had turned see-through and was sticking to his chest, and his stockings and velvet knee breeches were splattered with mud. We shivered as the water continued to trickle inside our clothes, but I wasn't ready to go up and warm up in another, drier story just yet. I couldn't take my eyes off the dark-haired young woman lying on the doorstep of a small house nearby crying. Her dress was filthy from days of wandering across the country, and her shawl looked just as sodden as my sweater, but none of that seemed to bother her. Her eyes were closed and she was waiting for death. Luckily, however, I knew that she was about to be rescued, because this was Jane Eyre, who had recently fled from Thornfield Hall and her beloved Mr. Rochester after discovering a dark secret from his past. Soon the clergyman, St. John Rivers, would appear, and he and his sisters would take Jane into their home. I was determined to wait and see it happen. Luckily, the rain was finally starting to die down. Such weather always brings to mind the poem Spring Celebration, Werther declared. Is not nature the wonderful after such a downpour? Yes, I said, but more wonderful, in my opinion, was the fact that St. John Rivers had just appeared and taken poor Jane inside the house. Yet again I had to remind myself that this wasn't a dream. I really was inside one of my favorite stories. Do you know it? It is by Klopstock, said Werther, suddenly giving me a strange sideways glance. What? Oh, the poem. I'm afraid not, I murmured. Werther seemed very disappointed by this, so I added hastily, but it sounds nice. Yes? He asked hopefully. Then you love nature just as I do? Of course, I said, nature and literature. Werther smiled and was about to launch into another speech about poetry when something very small and very blue came plummeting out of the sky toward us and landed on Werther's nose. The thief has struck again, piped the fairy. We saw him. He's wearing a cloak and sneaking through the Wizard of Oz. We're on our way, I called. The fairy went zooming off, and we followed her at a run. We arrived a few minutes later at the gray farm where Dorothy had lived with her uncle, her aunt, her dog Toto, and all four of them came running out to meet us in great agitation. He was here, cried Dorothy's uncle, a man with gray hair and a gray face to match. The thief was in our story. He stole the cyclone that's supposed to carry off Dorothy and our house, explained Dorothy's aunt, who looked just as colorless as the farmland around her. Who was it? I asked. How did you do it? How on earth did somebody steal a cyclone? We couldn't tell. All we saw was a shadow, sobbed Dorothy. He was so far away, he came sneaking through our pages, right at the edges, and then over there on the horizon he broke something out of the story, something that lit up. He tucked it inside his cloak. Then all of a sudden he was gone. She sniffed hard and Toto howled. Since then the cyclone's been missing. What would anybody want with a stolen cyclone? I asked. Dorothy shrugged. It is a mystery to me, murmured Werther. We looked out at the horizon. Not so much as a breath of wind was stirring. Will lay on a threadbare sofa and tried to imagine what it must be like to be dead. Had Holmes stopped existing completely, or had he just passed on to another place? What was it like there? Was he angry with Will for bringing him to the outside world and putting him in danger? Question after question whirled through his head as if there were a storm raging inside his skull. He couldn't concentrate. He thought it would get easier if he only didn't have to look at those words anymore. He painted over the writing on the wall above the stove in the white paint to stop it intruding on his thoughts, but he'd found that he could still read it, and in any case the words were already etched into his memory. He could see them even when he closed his eyes, blazing red before him. I have awoken. Who the H had left him that message, and what did it mean? He would have liked to tip another bucket of white paint over his own thoughts. Will hadn't been to the secret library for 2 days. Not since the argument with Amy, and why should he? He wasn't a book jumper anymore, and nobody would pay any attention to his warnings. Instead, he lay on the sofa, lost in thought, as the sun's brief guest appearance came to an end, and the air grew colder and damper. Betsy had come to the cottage yesterday. She stood outside and knocked at the door and said that Laird would not allow this, and that Will had to come to lessons. In the afternoon, Glen had come by and asked Will if he was still alive, or had he drowned in self-pity. He hadn't replied, but he had to admit that he was starting to go a bit stir-crazy in here. He sat up and put on his boots. Perhaps fresh air and a little exercise would make him feel like himself again. He didn't realize how dark it was until he opened the door. It was night time already. The starry sky arched high and clear over the ghostly expanse of the moor. Wisps of fog hung in the air above the slippery paths that snaked through the heather, peat moss, and sundew. He breathed in and then out again. On the wind was the tang of moist earth. Will stepped out into the darkness. He'd been roaming this moorland since childhood, and it greeted him tonight with the same sucking, gurgling noises he'd come to know well. Um, it covered most of Stormsay, and Will knew it concealed some treacherous depths. People even said there were lost graves from Celtic times hidden somewhere on the island, but Will wasn't afraid, not even when the fog patches thickened and wrapped themselves around his shoulders like a clammy shawl. It soon grew so misty that the light of the stars was barely visible, and he switched on the little flashlight he always wore at his belt. Immediately a beam of light sliced through the darkness around him. He could just make out something darting away from him at the edge of his field of vision, something big, something that couldn't possibly be an animal. He stood still and swung the flashlight around in a circle, trying to see what it was that had fled from him. Or had he just been scared by his own shadow? He was about to conclude that this must have been the case when the flashlight fell on a human form. It slipped into a gap between two bushes a few yards away from him and stopped dead. In the fog, Will could distinguish was its outline, but it was definitely a human being. "Who's there?" No answer. "Hello?" The figure hovered motionless in the fog. Then Will took a step toward it. It retreated before him, farther into the darkness. "What's going on?" called Will. "Betsy? Glen? Amy, is that you?" He quickened his pace. There was a rustling laugh, and then all at once the shadow was gone. Will ran to a spot where he'd last seen it. He shone the flashlight over the bushes and berries that grew on this part of the moor. Some of them looked as though they had been trodden flat. Suddenly there was a whisper from behind him. "She knew," breathed a voice, "that he would that he would stop the monster." The words ensnared him, enticed him, echoed strangely in his head. Will felt someone's breath on the back of his neck. He turned around, but there was nobody there. In the pool of flashlight were a few pillows of moss and a sound of rotting vegetation, and nothing more. Whoever had been standing behind him seemed to have vanished in a matter of seconds into thin air. What was going on here? Was someone trying to freak him out? "She knew," said the echo in Will's head, "that he would stop the monster." What kind of bizarre phrase was that? Had he read it somewhere? Ever since I'd found out who Alexis was visiting when she went off on one of her long walks and snuck out of bed at night, evenings at Lennox's house had gotten a whole lot quieter. Having pretended to be asleep the day before, I'd managed to avoid Alexis yesterday by locking myself in the bathroom and spending hours in the bath. By this evening at dinner, Lady Merritt had announced that she all wanted us to have a game of Monopoly after dessert, which was why Alexis and I had been sitting at the table for what felt like an eternity staring down at a brightly colored Monopoly board. It was late past midnight, and I was tired from my trips to Jane Eyre and Wizard of Oz, but my grandmother couldn't even seem to get enough. "Your go, Amy." Lady Merritt prompted me from the head of the table. She'd just bought Park Lane and was busy counting a substantial heap of Monopoly money. I rolled the dice and got sent to jail. Great. Alexis brought a railroad. Lady Merritt was still counting her money. When she'd finally finished, she looked first at Alexis and then at me. Both of us were stone-faced, and she slammed her wad of cash down on the table. Fine, she said. Fine, fine, fine. There doesn't seem to be much point in this. I thought playing a game might take your mind off things, but it seems I was wrong. So what's the matter with the two of you? Nothing, I said, scratching out a little blob of sauce on the tablecloth. Alexis was silent. I folded my arms. Alexis put her heads in her hands and closed her eyes. Lay Mare head sighed. You haven't so much as looked at each other for days. Where are we? Nursery school? I laughed out loud. Nursery school is very apt. Alexis looked at me incredulously. Amy, I told you I can explain. Why won't you at least listen to what I've got to say? I pressed my lips together. Would you rather carry on sulking like a 5-year-old? Let's clear this thing up. What is there to clear up? I snorted. You managed to get over Dominic at the speed of light? Great. You've fallen in love again? Great. You know what? It is great, cried Alexis. In love? What's all this, Alexis? Asked Lady Merritt. Here on Stormsay? With who? Neither of us paid any attention to my grandmother. You could at least have told me, I hissed. I thought you trusted me. I thought we told each other everything. There was a bitterness in my voice. But I guess I was wrong. First my so-called friends in Bochum had betrayed me. Now my own mother. Was everyone I cared about conspiring against me? Alexis blinked. I wanted to tell you, but that you were too busy snogging, right? Does this mean you're going to stay? Inquired Lady Merritt. Once the holidays are over, are you going to get married, Alexis? She looked as though all her dreams were coming true. You could live here at Lennox House, of course, she mused aloud. Is it Henk or the ferryman? Alexis stood up. I don't know how to make you see, Amy. What I have with him is something special. She walked around the table and laid a hand on my wrist. Oh, yes, I said theatrically. Even I could see how mean I was being to her, but I couldn't help myself. Young love, I hissed. Very young love. Stop it, said Alexis, angry now. Stop embarrassing yourself. She pulled me out into the hallway, away from Lady Merritt and her wedding plans. Let's talk about this properly, okay? She put her hands on my shoulders. I shook them off. I'd say you're the one who's embarrassing yourself, I said. Do you know what it looks like when you kiss him? He's barely a day older than me. Alexis sighed and lowered her voice as if she were afraid my grandmother might be listening at her door. He only looks young, Amy. Desmond isn't a real person. He's a book character. Yes, I know. Will already told me, blah, blah, blah. But even if he was 1,000 years old, what about Dominic? I mean, how could you forget him so quickly? Do you ever even remember how upset you were 2 weeks ago? Of course I do, murmured Alexis. And part of me is still upset, but on the other hand, you found a passable replacement. Would you stop interrupting me all the time? Cried Alexis. I'm trying to explain. Well, fine, please do, because I really don't understand. My whole body was shaking now, and I was finding it hard to breathe normally. Alexis nodded and thought for a moment, and then took my hand. Come with me, she said quietly. It's time you knew the whole story. What whole story? I'd stumbled after her. Come with me, Alexis said again. We climbed the stairs to the top of the floor of the house when we reached the corridor where our bedrooms were. Alexis led me straight past them and down to the end of the hallway to a door hidden behind a wall hanging, which I explained why I had never noticed it before. Behind the door was a steep staircase whose boards creaked beneath our feet as we climbed higher and higher. We soon found ourselves peering into the dusty darkness of an enormous attic. Chests and assorted bits of junk were piled almost to the roof beams. We still hadn't reached our destination. Alexis now made for a rickety old chest of drawers, from which she pulled several blankets before directing me toward a narrow ladder that led up to the skylight. Dust rained down on us as she opened the hatch. We pushed through a veil of cobwebs and out onto the roof, where we were met by the icy chill of the night air. I shivered. Alexis went ahead, wobbling across the ancient roof tiles toward a dormer window and spreading out one of the blankets. On its flat, narrow surface, I slithered after her, trying not to look down. When I reached Alexis, she draped a second blanket around both of our shoulders. When we sat down and laid the third blanket over our legs, we were both out of breath from the climb. For a while, neither of us said a word. Overhead, millions of stars glittered like diamonds in the black velvet of a jewelry box. Below us lay the moor, swathed in thick fog. In the distance loomed the silhouette of McAllister Castle. There were still lights out in some of its windows. Lights on in some of its windows. This was my favorite place when I was your age, said Alexis at last. I nodded. Because you can see the whole island from here? Because your grandmother never thought to come looking for me here. I said, wrapping the blanket more tightly around my shoulders. Something glimmered out on the moor, a little light. Or was I mistaken? Alexis took a lock of my hair between her fingers, twiddled it for a moment, and tucked it gently back behind my ear. I didn't mean to hurt you, little giraffe, she whispered. But you did. I kept my eyes on the moor where the tiny point of light now appeared to be moving. The thing about Desmond is, I didn't just throw myself at the nearest man I could find, and I did want to tell you about it, but I couldn't. Desmond and I have known each other for a very long time. In fact, He's one of the reasons I left Stormsay in the first place. I turned to look at her. My mom suddenly seemed older. Nothing about her was lively or colorful now. Even her hair looked dull all of a sudden. I spotted little wrinkles in the skin around her eyes. You and him back then, were you? Alexis's eyes bored into mine. Desmond, she said slowly, as if it cost her great effort. Desmond is your father. I looked out across the moor again. The little dot of light had vanished. I stared at the fog patches without really seeing them. Amy? Murmured Alexis. I shut my eyes for a moment at what she'd just told me sank slowly into my brain. Desmond was my father. It sounded absurd. I saw him in my mind's eye. To all appearances, he was barely older than me. A book character with burns on his face who had been living in the secret library for generations. I was used to not having a father. The very idea of it felt wrong. I, Amy Lennox, did not have a father. That was how it had always been. Alexis couldn't just come along and Amy, I blinked. Alexis lifted her hand as if to stroke my cheek, but when it was halfway there, she let it drop again. We never told anyone, said Alexis. Desmond and I always met in secret. We knew it was forbidden. A book jumper and a book character, the clans would have flipped. They would never have allowed it. If they'd caught us, Desmond and I loved each other very much, but we knew we would always have to hide. And then there was the fact that Desmond doesn't age. Even at 17, I knew our love couldn't last. We meant the world to each other, but at the same time, there was this constant fear, the fear that we'd been found out. And I was afraid I'd get old and Desmond would lose his interest in me. And then when I realized I was pregnant, I stammered, I thought you went away because of something that happened in the book world. Alexis smiled sadly. Yes, that too. My practice book in those days was Anna Karenina, and I found it difficult to watch as Anna's love destroyed her, and she threw herself under the train at the end. Anna and I were friends, she cleared her throat. And that was how I knew I had to do something about my own situation. If I didn't want to end up like her, sooner or later my love for Desmond would have destroyed me too. I was sure of it. I realized I had to go away. I told my family I couldn't bear to carry on jumping anymore. But really, you were leaving because you wanted to get away from Desmond? I didn't want to get away from him, but I had to, mainly because I was afraid of how the clans would react to a baby that was, well, it was only half human. Only half human? I felt as though the roof had given away beneath me. My stomach lurched, and a thick fog filled my head. Only half human. Only half human. Alexis was still talking, but all I could hear were those three words. Only half human. I'd always known I was different, but this different? Thought that if I left straight away, everyone would think your father was someone from the mainland. I looked at my hands, turning them this way and that in front of my face. They were human hands. There was no way I could be half fictional, was there? I have to keep it a secret, okay, Amy? Amy? She shook me. I let my hands drop. Out of my mouth came an unintelligible croak. Are you okay? No, I was shivering again. Alexis put her arms around me and drew my face into the crook of her neck. She stroked my back. Of course you're not, she said. This must be a shock for you. I didn't even want to have to tell you about all this. Really, that's why Desmond and I tried to keep it a secret that we were seeing each other again, but I hung heavy in her arms as if turned to stone. I don't think you've inherited all that much literariness from him, you know, Alexis went on. Before your first jump, I was very nervous about how your body would react, about whether you'd even be able to use the portal, about whether you'd be able to get back on your own. But it looks like the only thing you've inherited from Desmond is the fact that you're quite a talented book jumper. And other than that, I can jump from anywhere, I whispered into her hair. I don't need a portal to get to the book world. Alexis's hand on my back stopped moving for a moment. I felt her breath catch in her throat, but she seemed to force herself to carry on breathing normally. That, she began after a while, seems pretty logical, actually. After all, book characters don't need a portal to get from the outside world back into their own stories, and since you don't come from or belong to any specific story, you can probably just jump into any story you choose. I said nothing. I breathed in the scent of her organic shampoo, which reminded me of my childhood, and tried to make sense of the bombshell my mom had just dropped. Eventually, however, Alexis let go of me. It's getting a bit cold, she said. Let's go to bed, shall we? I nodded. As Alexis bundled up the blankets, I looked again for the light on the moor. It had vanished. There was movement, however, on the grounds of Lennox House. There wasn't that a shadow flitting between the hedges? Something dark, definitely not a stray sheep. It looked as though somebody was creeping along between the flower beds. Somebody with their hood up. I squinted but couldn't make out anything distinct. So I clambered back across the roof after Alexis lowered myself through the skylight and climbed back down the ladder. Alexis put the blankets away in the chest of drawers, and we said goodnight outside her bedroom door, and I muttered something about wanting to get a glass of water from the kitchen and rush downstairs through the dark corridors of the mansion, across the entrance hall and out, at last into the grounds. The figure had been a little way from the house, somewhere over there by the rose bushes. Gravel crunched under my feet. I tried to move more quietly, intending to creep up on whoever it was, and stubbed my toe in a bird bath. Crap! I bit my lip to keep myself from yelping as I hopped around on one leg, clutching my throbbing toe, spraying gravel in all directions. I fervently hoped it would sound like nothing more than one of the sheep having a nightmare. Crouched low, I pressed myself against one of the neatly trimmed hedges and inched along it toward the next turning in the path, but the hedge seemed to go on forever. It felt like an eternity before I finally reached the break in the foliage and peered around the corner, but there was nobody there. Roses twined, solitary and peaceful, around a metal archway. The lawn beyond glistened with dew. 33, mumbled a voice behind me, so suddenly that it made me jump. When I turned around, I found myself face to face with Brock, still wearing his blue dungarees and muttering numbers to himself. His eyes were trained on the path, and his hair and beard were unkempt and dirty. There was no sign of a hood. "Oh, hello," I said, backing away a little. Are you counting again?" "Yes," he grunted without looking up. Brock likes counting at night. "Oh, okay, I'll just let you get on with it. The black pebbles," he barked, pointing to a few isolated dark nuggets among the light gray gravel on the path. "Pretty. 34, 35, 36, 37." He carried on walking. "Right then, enjoy," I murmured as I headed back to the house. I was dog-tired when I finally got back to my room and snuggled down under the quilt of my four-poster bed. But sleep was out of the question. My toe hurt and my head was buzzing. Desmond was my father. I was half fictional, and the thief was sneaking around somewhere on Stormsday under a cover of night. According to my phone, it was already 1:30. I had to be up for lessons in a few hours, but still I reached for the e-reader on my bedside table and scrolled through the library. I wouldn't be able to sleep now anyway, that was for sure. The prospect of spending hours tossing and turning and going over everything in my mind wasn't particularly inviting. What I needed was an escape from reality, a little rest and relaxation in a benevolent world that rolled out thrillers and fantasy adventures and stories for starters. I scrolled on past some sloppy romances. I really was not in the mood for lovers slobbering all over each other. A children's books section looked more promising. I browsed through some fairy tales and children's classics and eventually clicked on Heidi. Yes, just the thing. A trip to an alpine pasture, a carefree afternoon with Heidi and Peter. That sounded like the perfect distraction. I selected a sunny, cheerful scene and laid the e-reader over my face. A moment later, I landed in a brightly blooming mountain pasture. A little girl was running toward me barefoot with an armful of flowers. She was laughing. The knight mounted his horse. Tucked inside his boot was the princess's dagger, and his saddlebags held provender, a map, and a thick, strong rope. Thus accoutred, he rode out into the kingdom. The princess waved farewell to him from the highest battlements of her castle. She knew that he would stop the monster. He would do as she had bidden him. I need to. Where was it? Where was I? Okay. I need to go get one of the cats. There's one still up there. Okay, I'm back. Oops. 9. The chase. It felt as though I'd barely had time to blink and already it was morning. The ringing of the alarm clock on my phone jolted me from sleep after what? Ringing of the alarm clock on my phone jolted me from sleep after what had been little more than 2-hour nap, and I dragged myself, head pounding, downstairs to breakfast. Alexis greeted me with a smile, no longer avoiding my eyes. Suddenly, everything she told me yesterday came flooding back. The fact that Desmond was my father still felt hard to believe, especially when he appeared a little while later at the entrance to the secret library, just as sessions were about to begin, and told us Glenn had gone to mainland to pick up a delivery of new books and had asked Desmond to stand in for him. He was dressed as always in his monk's habit. The web of thin scars on his face spread from the left corner of his mouth across his cheek and up to his temple, where it disappeared into his blond hair, but in spite of everything he must have lived through, his gray eyes were still those of a young man, and so were the long, slim hands emerging from the sleeves of his robe, with which he beckoned us to follow him. Desmond glided smoothly down the spiral staircase. My eyes were glued to the back of his head as I slithered, much less elegantly, down the steps. My neck ached as if every shelf in the library had collapsed on top of me. My eyes were swollen from lack of sleep. I was limping a bit, too, behind me. Betsy and Will had unexpectedly turned up to lessons this morning, were muttering something about the laird who had apparently flown into a rage only the day before and made all sorts of wild threats to Will because he wasn't jumping anymore. I was longing to flop down on my chair, lay my head on the desk, and have a little snooze, but Desmond wasn't taking us to the classroom. Instead, he led us deeper inside the library than I'd ever been before. He grabbed a cast-iron lantern, lit it, and strode on down ever dustier aisles of shelves, as if he'd been this way 100 times before. He probably had, I reflected, over the course of many, many decades, perhaps even centuries. The shelves around us were so crammed with increasingly moldy books that they had started to sag. There was a smell of very old paper, and our route took us continually downhill. The library seemed to be carving its way deeper and deeper into the bedrock of the island. At the same time, it grew steadily darker all around us, and the passageways lit only by the odd lamp here and there. Eventually, the lamps stopped altogether. The yellow light of Desmond's lantern danced ahead of us and threw shadow patterns on the rows of books and scrolls as we passed. We entered a circular room, somewhere deep beneath the island. It had walls of roughly hewn rock, and was completely empty apart from a clawfoot table in the middle. "This is the end of the secret library," Desmond explained. "There are no more books here, apart from this one." He pointed to the table. We moved closer now, and I saw that there was a pane of glass built into the carved wooden tabletop, and that beneath the glass lay a few scraps of charred paper. I read the words "monster" and "night" written on one of the larger fragments was the phrase, "I choose you," said the princess. "Kneel." "This is all that remains of the manuscript," said Desmond. "It is all that your ancestors were able to rescue from the flames. Just these scraps of paper and us." His hands trembled on the glass. He looked me straight in the eye, and a look of pain that was much older than his outward appearance flickered across his face. "Glenn, Clyde, and I, we can never go back. We have been living on the outside world ever since, getting by as best we can on Stormside. Please don't condemn me," his eyes seemed to say. I nodded almost imperceptibly. Since my conversation with Alexis, I no longer blamed either of them for having fallen in love. When people lived so close together on such a tiny island, they were going to fall in love sometimes, like it or not. The whole thing was still weird, obviously. Finding out that Desmond was my father had been a shock, but I would get used to it in time. "I didn't know there was so much of it left," said Betsy, leaning over the pane of glass with evident interest. "It's a shame none of it seems to be connected. Have you tried to fit the pieces together?" "We have tried everything, believe me, but it is difficult," said Desmond. "Too many memories." Will, too, seemed fascinated by the remnants of the manuscript. He pored over the scraps of paper dotted with burn holes and soot marks. "He would stop the monster," he murmured under his breath. I, on the other hand, was still staring at Desmond. He was studiously avoiding looking at the manuscript. "Who," I began at last, gnawing at my bottom lip. I hardly dared ask the question, but I felt that I had to know, if I was to understand who and what my father was. "Glenn said the manuscript was a fairy tale," I whispered at last, too quietly for Betsy and Will to hear. "Who were you in the story? What was it about?" Desmond lowered his eyes. "I was a knight," he said, "and the story was about the pursuit of a terrible monster. Then he handed me the lantern. "You three go back. Glenn wants you to spend some time in your practice books today." "But don't you need light for the way back?" I asked. The lantern was heavier than I'd expected. "No, I know the way." He looked as if he wanted to be alone for a while in the darkness, alone with his memories. We left him. Half an hour later, Betsy jumped from the stone circle into her book of fairy tales, and I jumped into the jungle, while Will sat on one of the boulders watching us. He was still refusing to return to the book world. I landed as usual among the roots of the giant jungle tree. By now I'd mastered the art of landing without falling over. As soon as the greenery in the forest unfolded around me, I picked my way out of the tangle of tree roots and went over to join Werther and Shere Khan the tiger, who were discussing the strange thefts and debating whether or not the fairies could be trusted. "Hello," I greeted them. "Ah, how wonderful, there you are," Werther beamed at me. The tiger gave me a nod. "So, any news?" I asked. "Dracula's on the warpath. Says somebody's raided his treasure chamber," rumbled Shere Khan. "Perhaps we should go there first, then, and have a scout around," I said to Werther, but he immediately turned a shade paler and shook his head. "If the fellow really has been robbed, it might be best to give his story a wide berth," Shere Khan chipped in. "He can be rather irascible at times, and when he gets like that, he'll bite you as soon as look at you. And besides, I already had an alternative plan," added Werther, straightening his ponytail, which had gotten tangled up in a creeper. "If you will permit me, Miss Amy, I should like to show you a flower." "A flower? It's a very special flower, the only one of its kind in all the universe. It is beautiful, just like you. If there really is a criminal going around and destroying stories, I would have thought this was the best time to be looking at ridiculous flowers," Shere Khan cut in. Werther pursed his lips, offended. "The botanical study is not ridiculous," he said. "Don't you agree, Miss Amy? Do you not wish to see this extraordinary flower?" He gazed hopefully at me. "It really is wonderfully, wonderfully pretty." "Well," I began hesitantly, "where is it? Is it far from here?" "Not at all. A stone's throw, so to speak." The tiger sighed. "At least wait for me to finish my next scene, then I'll come with you. Who knows what the thief is up to? You need somebody to protect you, book jumper." Werther squared his shoulders beneath his embroidered frock coat. "I am perfectly capable of protecting a young lady under my—" "Wait for me," repeated Shere Khan, and slunk off through the undergrowth. Werther was evidently affronted, and barely said a word as the three of us set out a little while later along the roads of the book world. Lips still pursed, he led us along a series of winding paths to another crossroads. This one has a signpost at its center, and we followed the sign for the Little Prince. Soon afterward, the road petered out in the middle of a sand dune. It was suddenly so stiflingly hot that I took off my sweater and tied it around my waist. In a t-shirt, I padded out across the fine golden yellow Sahara sand that stretched out in billowing waves to the horizon. The air shimmered above the smooth hills, and it was a while before we could make out what the dark blob in the middle of the desert actually was. It turned out to be an airplane with somebody sitting in the sand beside it. "It doesn't look to me as though there are many flowers around here," grumbled Shere Khan. "Ah, just you wait," said Werther, striding on ahead with his head held high. I followed them, trying to think what I knew about the story we were in. I'd heard of the Little Prince, of course. When I was at primary school, there had been a poster on the wall showing a boy perched on the surface of a tiny planet. But as for the plot, I seemed to recall something about a fox asking to be tamed. What else? I couldn't remember what the desert had to do with the story. We marched for a long time over the hot sand before reaching the aircraft, which turned out to be a little propeller plane. Various tools lay scattered on the ground beside it. A man with an old-fashioned flying cap on his head was sitting with his back to the landing gear. He seemed to have given up on repairing his plane for the time being and was scribbling something on a piece of paper. A small boy with white blonde hair, dressed in a long blue coat, was looking over his shoulder. "No, that sheep is too old," said the little prince. "Draw me another one." The man screwed up the piece of paper and started again. Not until we were standing right in front of them did the man and the boy look up. "Good day," said Werther. "Please do not let us disturb you. I merely wish to show this young lady—" "Can any of you draw me a sheep?" asked the little prince. "I would so love to take a sheep back with me to my planet." "Well," I said, "I could try, but wouldn't that be interfering in the plot?" The little prince shook his head. "I'd hide your drawing in my pocket. Then I'd have two sheep, yours and the one he's drawing." He pointed to the man. "There'd be just enough space on my asteroid for both of them. But we'll still tell the readers there's only one sheep." "Fair enough," I said, and I too sat down in the sand. The pilot gave me a pencil and a sheet of paper from his notepad. I started drawing and the little prince turned to Shere Khan. "Would you put off eating a flower if it had 4 thorns?" he asked. "Tigers don't eat flowers," said Shere Khan. "But if they did?" inquired the prince, and told us about his lone planet where there were 3 knee-high volcanoes and a rose with 4 thorns. He told us if you didn't watch out, the surface of the planet became overrun with baobab trees. Bit by bit, the story came back to me of the little prince who left his asteroid to find a friend and ended up visiting a whole series of other planets fishing with the Earth, where he tamed a fox and realized that he loved a rose that he had left behind in spite of her capricious nature. I drew the prince a woolly little lamb and handed it to him. "Thank you," he said, putting the piece of paper in his coat pocket. "So you've come to see my flower?" Werther nodded. "There is no flower like her in the universe, after all." "Yes," sighed the little prince. "And she's all the way up there, so far away from me, but when I look at the stars, I'm happy because I know she's waiting for me." Said Shere Khan, who had been studying the sky for a while now with his head tipped back. "What did you say the thief was doing, Werther? Stealing the core ingredients?" We looked up. At the same moment, the little prince began to sob loudly. "No," he cried, "not my flower!" And the sky was a whole little row of little planets. And on one of the asteroids, where I could also make out the silhouettes of three knee-high volcanoes, a shadow was plucking the most beautiful rose I had ever seen. The little prince screamed when the stem finally broke. The rose glowed brightly for a moment and then disappeared. The prince threw himself down on the sand and beat it with his fists. Werther and I exchanged a glance and set off at a run. Shere Khan overtook us in huge bounds. He struck out his paw with it at an insignificant-looking stone lying in the sand, and the desert snapped shut on top of us. We flicked through the pages of the story as fast as we could until we found ourselves out in space. By the time we reached the little prince's asteroid, the thief was gone. Where the rose once stood, all that remained were the first few shoots of a baobab tree poking up out of the ground. There was something moving, however, on one of the neighboring planets, which was very small and inhabited by a king in a voluminous ermine robe. "Ah, subject! What a pleasant surprise!" cried the king. We skipped hastily forward a few pages, jumping from planet to planet. "We mustn't let him escape," panted Werther. Beads of sweat stood out on his pale forehead. The tiger growled in agreement. "I've a good mind to rip somebody to shreds," he bared his teeth. But the thief was fast. We followed his shadow past a lonely lamplighter, a garden full of roses, and a fox who begged us to tame him. But we couldn't catch up with the thief, so deftly did he skip back and forth between the pages. At last we came to the end of the story and found ourselves on a road that stretched across a tract of English countryside. We saw the shadow go scurrying off into the distance. Shere Khan was about to set off in pursuit when Werther came to a halt and stood bent double with his hands on his knees, puffing and puffing. I was out of breath too. "We must go on," urged the tiger. He closed his yellow cat's eyes for a moment and sighed. "Climb onto my back." "If you must, I will carry you." "A gentleman does not ride on a tiger," said Werther, "and a lady most certainly does not." But I had already swung myself up onto the tiger's muscular back. "Come on, we don't have time for this," I called. Werther dabbed at his face with his embroidered handkerchief for a moment before finally relenting and clambering laboriously onto the tiger's back behind me. Shere Khan shot off toward the horizon. He bounded over the hills so fast that the countryside around us soon became a blur. I held tightly to his fur while Werther clung to my shoulders, yelping. Soon we were whizzing past mansions, balls of fine ladies sitting in drawing rooms and pianos, and Shere Khan was flicking us through the story far too quickly for me to make out any details. The tiger's back rocked back and forth so violently with every bound that I had to focus all my energies on not falling off. The whole thing reminded me of my first and only ever ride on a roller coaster a few years before. In the end, I just shut my eyes and prayed it would soon be over. Behind me, Werther was yelling something about having a delicate stomach. Our wild ride through the novel ended as suddenly as it had begun. Shere Khan came to such an abrupt halt that Werther and I were flung forward and fell head over heels into the grass. We were greeted by the sound of voices and quickly got to our feet. Feeling slightly wobbly, we made our way to where the source of the sounds. Dusk had fallen over the English countryside, and there was somebody sitting in a ditch by the roadside nearby, but it wasn't the thief in his hooded cloak. It was a girl a few years older than me with dark hair and dark eyes. She was wearing a ball gown, its skirts stained with blood, and cradling her right leg, which was sticking out sideways at a funny angle. Her face was contorted with pain. Four other girls in frilly dresses, all bearing a strong resemblance to the injured girl, were clustered around and talking to her along with a middle-aged married couple who looked like their parents behind a an overturned carriage with a broken wheel axle. Two horses pawed the dusty ground nervously. "Have you had an accident?" I asked. The father of the family nodded. Somebody appeared in the road all of a sudden, he said, stroking his whiskers in puzzlement. A hooded figure just like that in the middle of the plot. We weren't able to stop in time. It's a mystery to me where this person suddenly appeared from. A mystery. Shere Khan, having prowled all the way around the scene of the accident, was now sniffing at the sand on the road. From the outside world, I should say, judging by the smell around here, he growled. Oh, we shall be late to Netherfield, cried one of the younger girls. It is too horrid. We may miss a whole dance. And there will be so many officers there, cried another. I approached the injured girl. Lizzie? I asked, for I had realized now which story we'd stumbled into. I'd read Pride and Prejudice so often that I was almost ashamed not to have recognized the family earlier. The girl nodded. Elizabeth Bennet, she introduced herself and added, turning to her sisters, I believe we will have to miss the ball entirely. I am afraid I have broken my leg. Now, Miss Bennet, the girl's mother, chimed in too. We cannot miss the ball, she cried. Your sister Jane must dance with Mr. Bingley. They are as good as engaged. It does not matter, mamma, said Jane, the eldest of the 5 daughters. What are you thinking of, child? Do you not want to be mistress of Netherfield Hall? Do you want your sisters reduced to poverty when your father dies? Come, Lucy, try to stand at least. You may be able to dance after all. Make haste, child. My dear, Mr. Bennet said with a sigh. Lizzie is hurt. We need a doctor, not a dance. He led his wife gently over to the upturned carriage. The coachman must have reached the village by now. Sit down here while we wait. Oh, groaned Miss Bennet, burying her head in her arms. My poor nerves. We must try to break her leg today of all days. Why must she break her leg today of all days? Indeed, that was most tactless of Lizzie, said Mr. Bennet. How could she be so selfish as to injure herself and compromise all your matchmaking schemes? Oh, wailed Miss Bennet again. The sisters were whispering together. Might we be of service to you? Brother asked Lizzie meanwhile. We happen to have a tiger with us, and he makes an excellent mount. We should be delighted to lend him. Shere Khan let out a hiss that clearly indicated he considered it beneath his dignity to be described as a mount. No, thank you, we will manage. The doctor will be here soon, said Lizzie quickly. I will probably have to forego balls for a while, but I do not mind that. I did not care to dance with that conceited Mr. Darcy anyway. Lizzie, cried Miss Bennet. I returned to the tiger. Someone from the outside world, you say? I felt a knot of rage form in my stomach. Now even Pride and Prejudice, one of my favorite books in the world, was coming apart at the seams. I had to find out who was responsible. Shere Khan nodded his massive predator's head. The scent is weak and not entirely clear, but unless I am very much mistaken, it smells rather like your island, Amy. When I got back to the stone circle, I realized it was already 5 o'clock in the afternoon. There was no sign of Betsy. She'd probably gone home long ago, but Will was still there. I glimpsed his tall, thin figure as the shadow of one of the stone arches where he lay sleeping in the grass. My stomach was rumbling. I hurriedly stuffed the red leather-bound copy of the Jungle Book into my bag. I was about to walk past Will and down the hill when something held me back. Perhaps it was a smile on his face. I'd only seen him looking serious and sad recently, and it was amazing how different he looked when the corners of his mouth quirked just a few millimeters upward. A dimple formed in his cheek. What was he dreaming about? Will's tousled hair was sticking up all over the place. His eyelashes formed 2 dark half-moons on his pale skin, and his cheekbones seemed to have grown even more angular over the past few days. Only his lips looked soft and relaxed, and gave his face a friendly sort of, I must have been over him, because my bag suddenly slipped off my shoulder and landed with a bump on Will's chest. He opened his eyes. Hi, I said, snatching up my bag again. Sorry, I dropped it. Will blinked at me, too drowsy to understand what had jolted him out of the pleasant dream he'd been having. What time is it? He mumbled. And now I have to charge the Nook. It says battery is dead. So, let me just plug the Nook into the computer. Okay. And I'll go downstairs really quick. Okay. Battery level is at 4 right now. So we'll give it a little bit of time. Oh, thank you. Merry Christmas. I think I'm going to blow my nose. I might be able to go back to reading. Let's see. Battery level is 10. Will blinked at me, too drowsy to understand what had jolted him out of the pleasant dream he'd been having. "What time is it?" he mumbled. "5 o'clock. I just got back in my bag." Will sat up. "5 o'clock? Man, I really could have done with a few more hours' sleep last night." "Tell me about it," I said, yawning. "It's a wonder I've been able to stay awake this long." All at once Will's eyes narrowed to slits, and the last traces of his dream smile faded. "Lessons finished hours ago. What have you been doing in the book world all this time?" He gave me a piercing glance. I remembered I was supposed to be angry with him for not wanting to jump anymore. I swallowed hard. "Nothing that would interest you. I know you prefer to just bury your head in the sand." Will raised his eyebrows. "Is everything okay? Are you okay?" He seemed genuinely concerned. I bit my lip. "There's been a few problems, but even that you've turned your back on the book world now, I'm sure you don't care." "Problems with Sherlock Holmes books? No idea. I'm not responsible for them. But it might be happening there too." I pushed past him to get to the path. "The thief is pretty diligent, at any rate." Today he ruined 2 stories in one go. He followed me. "Do you still think somebody's stealing ideas on purpose?" "I don't think it, I know it. We've seen it, okay?" "Okay," he said quietly. "So you've changed your mind? You don't think I'm being naive, and that the characters are just playing pranks on me? Or that I'm the one messing everything up?" He shook his head. "I've been reading Alice in Wonderland. The whole story is basically kaput. It does look really bad, and not like an accident. No crap." "I'm sorry, I didn't believe you at first. It's okay." As we made our way slowly down the hill, I told him about the latest thefts and about Elizabeth Bennet's carriage accident. "How exactly does somebody steal a cyclone?" asked Will the moment I'd finished. "No idea. I've been wondering the same thing myself, but," I said, looking straight into his great blue eyes, "did you happen to see Betsy when she landed back here? Did she have a rose with her?" Will stopped dead. "You think Betsy's the thief? Why would she do something like that?" I blew a stray lock of hair out of my face. "It was just a thought. Shere Khan reckons it might be somebody from Stormsay, and since I'm not sure what to make of it—" I fell silent. From somewhere overhead came a crunching, rumbling sound. Suddenly several things happened at once. Something very large and very heavy broke free of its moorings above our heads, and came half rolling down the hill, half hurtling through the air towards us. Will grabbed me by the shoulders and flung himself against me with such force that we both fell to the ground. I landed roughly on my hip bone, and jabbed myself in the ribs with my own elbow, and Will landed on top of me, and there, onto the very spot where I'd just been standing, one of the gigantic boulders that made up the stone circle, came crashing down to the earth. The stone slammed into the grass so hard we felt the ground shake. I clung to Will in terror, digging my fingers into his back, while he shielded my head with his arms. The tips of our noses touched. At last everything went quiet again. We looked at each other for a moment, and then Will rolled off of me, stood up, and offered me his hand. I let him help me up. "What was that?" I asked once I'd got to my feet. My knees felt like jelly, and I was pretty sure it wasn't just the shock. Will pointed up to the brow of the hill where one of the stone gateways was now, unmistakably missing its horizontal stone lintel. How many hundreds of years had those things been up there standing? I massaged my rib cage. "Something like that doesn't just fall apart by itself, does it?" I muttered. Will rubbed his face and eyes, and squinted back up at the now broken archway. "No," he said at last, "especially not at the precise moment you're standing underneath it. I would have thought. It was very difficult to recognize the monster, for it was cunning and disguised itself well. Unless you looked closely, you might almost have taken it for a human being. Almost." I have about 9 chapters left. Soon, visitors to Lennox House. Over the next few days, Shere Khan, Werther, and I trawled the book world for clues as to the identity of the thief. After the incident in the Stone Circle, Will finally believed my theory that there was somebody with evil intentions causing havoc in the book world, and he asked for regular updates on our progress, but he still wasn't trying to jump again himself. No matter how much I urged him, and unfortunately none of the fictional characters we questioned had seen the thief's face or indeed anything other than the hooded cloak. We were still groping in the dark. More ideas were stolen, and we didn't manage to catch so much as a glimpse of the hooded figure. Whoever it was seemed to have learned from the chase through the Little Prince and Pride and Prejudice and had now adopted a more circumspect and above all slower approach. By this time I was almost certain Betsy had something to do with the thefts. I had been watching her closely during lessons, and I'd seen how nervously she glanced at us one break time when the subject of Dracula's stolen gold had come up. At the first mention of the vampire, who was still incandescent with rage, Betsy had been so startled that she accidentally poked herself in the eye. And a sloppily mascaraed eye at that, with the rubber on the end of her pencil. To me, that was clear indication of her guilt, but Will assured me time and time again that Betsy saw the protection of the book world as her sole purpose in life, and that he really couldn't imagine her ever doing anything to harm literature. So as July gave way to August, we still didn't have any new information, and one day a great commotion broke out at Lennox House. It turned out that the anniversary of the clan's truce was just around the corner, and that this year it fell to the family to organize the celebrations. All of a sudden I noticed that Mr. Stevens was never to be found without a mop or some other cleaning utensil in his hand, and that the house sparkled or shone more brightly with every passing day. One afternoon I saw him perched on a ladder, his smart suit twinned with yellow rubber gloves, polishing each individual curlicue of the chandelier in the entrance hall. And Alexis squealed like a stuck pig when she staggered into the bathroom early one morning to find Mr. Stevens in our bathtub, whistling merrily as he descaled the shower head, as if the guests were ever going to set foot in our little attic bathroom. But Mr. Stevens, who seemed to harbor a secret passion for cleaning, scrubbed and polished everything in his path, and my grandmother left him to it. She was really very glad, she said, that our butler showed such enthusiasm for such disagreeable tasks. The family had to forego the luxury of employing a cleaner years ago. Lady Marad herself, meanwhile, wrote endless shopping lists and mused aloud about table decorations and menus and the intolerable tastes of the intolerable laird, and generally became increasingly grouchy. One evening she inquired crossly of Alexis whether we'd brought any suitable clothes with us. We were barely presentable, apparently, in our usual attire. The next day we found ourselves drowning in a sea of fabric as we battled with the puffed sleeves of the cocktail dresses Mr. Stevens had brought for us on mainland. As I stood in front of the mirror on the evening of the party, my mood plunged as low as my grandmother's. My dress was bottle green, like the stag in our family's coat of arms, with a puffy tulle skirt that ended just above the knee. It looked like an excessively generous tutu, but what the dress lacked in skimpiness at the bottom it made for at the top. True, I didn't miss the enormous puffy sleeves which Alexis, thank goodness, had unpicked for me, but the neckline could have done with being somewhat less low-cut, and the narrow straps drew unflattering attention to my bony shoulders. Alexis was wearing an identical dress in wine red, and it made her look like a princess. Lady Merritt, at any rate, was delighted with her daughter when we stepped into the banqueting hall on the ground floor around 7 o'clock. But she seemed to resent the fact that I had slung on one of my baggiest cardigans over the top of my dress. Only a narrow strip of tulle could be seen poking out at the bottom. I get cold easily, I muttered. Lady Merritt, who was wearing a wine red and green checked shawl over her shiny black dress, did not reply, Perhaps it was not my outfit that the imminent arrival of our guests had made her expression turn sour, I thought, and at that moment Reed McAllister, Laird of Stormsay, announced Mr. Stevens from the other end of the hall. Lady Mare at side as the Laird, dressed from head to toe in tartan, rolled into the hall in his wheelchair. He was followed by Betsy and Will. Will was wearing a jacket that matched his dark hair beautifully, and a kilt. I've always found the idea of men in skirts faintly ridiculous, but seeing Will in his dark green and grey blue checked kilt, which sat so perfectly on his hips and showed off his well-muscled calves in their traditional knee-high socks, I promptly changed my mind. Will looked so different without his scuffed boots and old sweater. He seemed even taller than usual, and the check pattern on his kilt was the same color as his eyes. Stormy blue eyes. I gulped. Even though Will and I had seen each other pretty much every day for weeks now, and were getting on really well together, a strange feeling constricted my throat. An old fear I'd almost forgotten over the past few weeks, but which now threatening to suffocate me, the fear of being laughed at, being mocked. Why did he have to look so perfect all of a sudden? On Will's arm, looking no less perfect, was Betsy. She floated across the parquet floor in an ice-blue dress with a cowl neck and a train. As they came closer, I did up the buttons on my cardigan just to be on the safe side, and took a half-step behind Alexis. I was trying to make myself invisible, but somehow I managed to do just the opposite. As I stepped backward, I collided with a chest-high marble pillar, on top of which Mr. Stevens had placed a vase full of roses for the grounds. The vase began to wobble, and though I lunged to catch it as it fell, shattered with a loud crash on the floor. Water and roses sprayed in all directions. Every head in the room turned to look at me. The old Laird let out a dry laugh. Betsy tittered. My face turned scarlet, and Alexis hurried off to fetch something to mop off the mess. I crouched down and started gathering up flowers and shards of broken glass, dunking my skirt in the spilled water in the process. Please do sit down, urged Lady Mary. Hoping to distract everybody, she moved to the head of the banqueting table, which Mr. Stevens had set with crystal glasses, weighty and silvery cutlery, and the good porcelain emblazoned with the family crest. The guests followed her. The great hall of Lennox House, just like its magnificent entrance hall, had a vaulted ceiling covered in paintings and with chandeliers fashioned from golden letters. It was about the size of a sports hall, and must originally have been used for hosting lavish balls. For the handful of clan members left on Stormsay, however, it was far too big. The table looked lost in the middle of the enormous hall. In fact, with a few extra folding chairs, we had been able to fit everybody here into our tiny kitchen back home in Bochum. The families felt the need to show off their wealth, Alexis whispered to me a few minutes later as Mr. Stevens wheeled in a hog roast on a trolley. It was a strange assortment of people. On my grandmother's right sat the Laird in his wheelchair, wearing an old-fashioned suit with a waistcoat and a scarf around his neck instead of a tie. His head was bald and shone with a grayish tinge. His eyebrows met in the middle and lowered like a black beam over his eyes. He stared down at his plate, lips pursed. To Lady Mary's left was my Uncle Finlay, languidly unfolding his napkin. I'd given up on trying to know him by this time. I'd been to visit him twice in his shop, and both times he managed to evade every single one of my questions about our family. Instead, he talked about the weather and tried to palm me off with some tinned sweet corn that was on special offer. Opposite us sat Betsy and Will, and at the foot of the table Glenn, Clyde, Desmond, in their usual grey robes. It was customary for the clans to invite the book characters who had survived the Great Fire to the anniversary feast. Mr. Stevens stirred up enough dishes to feed a small army, glistening joints of roast meat, bowls of mashed potatoes and steamed carrots, croquettes, salmon and cream sauce, beans with bacon, various soups and salads, skewers of grilled vegetables, rice with spicy sauce, tofu cutlets. There was so much that I seriously started to wonder when and how we'd managed to prepare it all. We watched in near silence as the table filled up. Despite the posh clothes and the mountains of food, most of the guests were in a distinctly unfestive mood. Wasn't it a bit ridiculous, after all, for two families who had hated each other for generations to insist on a gathering like this? At last, once all the dishes had been served up, and there was not so much as an egg cup's worth of space left on the pristine tablecloth, Lady Mary had cleared her throat. "Welcome, dear guests," she began, forcing a smile. "Welcome to the celebration of the 293rd anniversary of our truce. Let us raise our glasses to the end of our feud, and to eternal friendship between the honorable clans of Lennox and McAllister. May both families always strive as one to protect the things we hold dear, the island of Stormsay and the world of literature that has been entrusted to our care." "Hear, hear," growled the laird. Everyone raised their crystal glasses and drank. "And now all that remains is for me to wish you bon appetit," said Lady Marad. The food was delicious. Unlike Betsy, who nibbled daintily on a few microscopic morsels, I chomped my way through as many dishes as I possibly could in quick succession, but the mood didn't lighten as much as the evening went on. The laird and the lady made a little stilted small talk. Desmond sprayed half the table with sauce after accidentally sticking his elbow in the bowl because he couldn't take his eyes off Alexis. Betsy eyed me and my still damp garments with disdain. Glenn and Clyde discussed the fact that some unknown person had apparently been helping themselves to Finley's food stocks. The evening finally hit rock bottom when we were eating dessert. It all started with a perfectly innocuous question from Will as he turned to Alexis over a vat of tiramisu. "So have you settled in well?" he asked, breaking the uncomfortable silence that had descended on the room between the main course and the cheese board. Alexis nodded. Her eyes darted almost imperceptibly to Desmond. "Yes, thank you. We feel almost at home." "Probably because this is your home," said Lady Merritt, spooning lemon cream into a little glass bowl. Said Alexis, and I thought that was the end of it, but after a moment she put down her spoon and added with a look of determination, "For another 2 weeks, at least." Desmond knocked over his glass. "I beg your pardon?" exclaimed Lady Merritt. "Well, you know we're just visiting. Amy's summer holidays are nearly over, and we have to go back to Germany soon." I shot a sideways glance at Alexis. She looked almost relieved about what she just said. Did she really want to leave the island? Leave Desmond? "But," I stammered, "the longer we'd spent here, the more difficult it had become to imagine ever having to leave." And I'd assumed Alexis felt the same way, but it seemed I'd been wrong. "That was always the plan." Alexis lowered her eyelids. "You have to go back to school." "She can do that here," said my grandmother. "The book world needs her." The laird snorted. "The book world would be a great deal safer without her." He crumpled the corner of the tablecloth in his hands. "Betsy tells me they're staying in the margin, that Amy goes roaming around the book world as if it were a playground. They even say she's been keeping young Werther from his story, and Amy knows she has to stay inside the Jungle Book," said Glenn. I sank lower in my chair. "But she doesn't stay there." Betsy jabbed a finger in my direction. "Everything's a joke to her. She goes around wreaking havoc in stories, and she doesn't even care. Just look what she's done to Alice in Wonderland." I tried to protest, but the words wouldn't come. No, the characters are just playing the fool again," said Glenn. But Betsy was adamant. "In the book world, they're saying Amy jumps whenever she likes." "And wherever she likes," she cried. The whole table fell silent. "What is the meaning of this?" asked Lady Marehead. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks again. "Nothing," I mumbled. "I didn't. I wasn't. I haven't been sneaking up to the portal." "Nonsense. She's the one who's been using the stone circle at night," declared the laird, pounding the table with his fist so hard it set the crockery clinking. "Amy is a danger to everything we McAllisters have fought for hundreds of years. There's a thief stealing ideas," I cried. "Werther and I were trying to catch him, but he keeps getting away from us." I'd had just about enough of this. I was certainly not the biggest threat to the book world right now. The laird drew himself up to his full height in his wheelchair and glared at me. "So you admit it? What? That you've been meeting with young Werther? That the two of you go wandering through the book world from story to story, somewhere different every day?" For a moment he rose unsteadily to his feet, but his legs could not support his weight. I let out a breath. "Yes," I said, "but I haven't been sneaking. You should never have been allowed to attend lessons. I knew it the moment I heard of your arrival. You ought not to have sent her to the secret library, Mered." The laird's eyes were almost popping out of their sockets. "She is a Lennox. She has a right to jump," hissed my grandmother, "and a duty." The laird let out an unpleasant laugh. "She is a further testament to the fact that your family is the worst thing that could possibly have happened to the world of literature. All she wants to do is throw her weight around. The naive little brat, and she has no respect for—" "Hey!" Alexis broke in indignantly. I tried again. "She brings shame on all book jumpers," said Betsy, helping her father back into his wheelchair. "Yes, great shame," the laird agreed. And as he did so, I was suddenly possessed by another braver Amy I hadn't known existed until now. "Stop it!" I yelled, jumping up from my seat. Alexis put a hand on my arm to hold me back, but I shook her off. I looked furiously at each of them in turn. "It's true, I never stayed inside the Jungle Book like I was supposed to. Not even once. Ever since the first time I jumped, I've been going into different stories, and often Werther does come with me, but the reason we're doing it is to look for the thief. Don't you get it?" There's something going on in the book world, something dangerous, something we have to put a stop to. Just look at the other books and you'll see Alice in Wonderland, The Wizard of Oz, The Little Prince. There are ideas missing all over the place. The stories don't work anymore. You can't just pretend that's not happening. But, murmured Glen, I talked myself into a rage. My voice echoed through the oversized hall as I continued. Everyone on this island is always talking about how it's our duty to protect literature, but you obviously don't really mean it, because that's exactly what I'm trying to do, protect it. I turned to Alexis. I'm sorry, but I'm not leaving. Not till we've caught the thief. A thief in the book world? A thief who steals ideas? That's ridiculous, bellowed the laird. His head had gone bright red, like a tomato with eyebrows. Oh, really? Asked Will. Do you still think Sherlock's death was an accident? Amy's right. There's something going on in the book world. And here on Stormsay, we have to do something. You're taking her side? Hissed the laird. A Lennox? He uttered our surname as if the word was something slimy and disgusting in his mouth. Will sighed. This is not about the childish hostility between our two families. It's about literature, he said. When are you going to realize the days of the clans and their feuds are over, bloody H? There are so few of us left. Childish, the laird grimaced. My grandmother had turned pale. Betsy was looking at Will as if she was seeing him for the first time. Suddenly everybody started shouting at once. I left the hall as quickly as I could. I hurried across the entrance hall and up the stairs and stumbled into my bedroom, where I switched on the bedside lamp and flopped down onto my bed. I could still hear Lady Marad and the laird yelling at each other from here. It was a long time before the voices fell silent, but at last, after several doors, including the front door, had been slammed, the house was quiet once more, so quiet that I jumped when I heard a knock at my bedroom door. Come in, I said without sitting up or opening my eyes. I wasn't sure I was ready to listen to Alexis's account of how the family party had ended just yet. The door opened and closed. I heard footsteps approach the bed and come to a stop a few feet away from me. I hate family parties, I grunted. Me too, said a male voice. I sat up. Will was standing in the middle of my room. He gazed for a moment at the books on my bedside table and the clothes I'd left lying around. These anniversary dinners always end up with everyone shouting at one another. Don't worry, he said at last, crossing his arms. I'm afraid when people live on Stormsay too long, they lose sight of the important things. I rubbed my cheeks and eyes. They felt wet. It's really not like me to get angry and to shout at people I barely know. I know, he said. Still, I'm starting to think you're the only sane person on this crazy island. You're right. We have to catch the thief before it destroys even more stories. Does that mean you're going to start jumping again? He blinked. I don't know. I don't know if that would be alright. It would. I got off the bed and started to gather up some of the clothes and kick the rest of the sight. The laird seems pretty angry with you, I remarked. You're telling me, Will shrugged, but he really surpassed himself today. He went so red I thought his head was going to explode, and everyone else carried on screaming at one another too until your mom mumbled something about the books she wanted to borrow and ran off with Desmond. Betsy, Clyde, and Glim were taking the laird home, and he faltered. When I looked up, I found his eyes fixed on me. They seemed to have got stuck at a point somewhere a little way below my chin, where there was an unexpected softness in them. I looked down at myself and got a bit of shock. The buttons of my cardigan must have come undone in all the commotion, and my dress was visible in all its skimpy glory. I hastily pulled the cardigan tight again. Will cleared his throat. I just came to tell you they've all gone, and I'm going to help you look for the thief, he stammered. I nodded and tucked a lock of hair behind my ears. Thanks. We looked at each other. The light from the bedside lamp cast a warm glow over Will's features, and I suddenly felt a little dizzy. Slowly, Will moved closer to me, and I took a small, unsteady step toward him. He smiled at me, and somewhere downstairs a door slammed. We both jumped. We heard a click of stiletto heels on the stairs. Is Bessie still here? I asked, my mouth dry. Will raised his eyebrows. I thought she'd gone with the others. We went into the corridor. Although I could still feel Will's eyes on me, I didn't dare look at him. We could still hear the footsteps, and now we heard voices too. What was that all about? Hissed Lady Marad from somewhere below us. What on earth were you thinking? I just wanted to, Betsy muttered something. Will and I tiptoed downstairs. After 1.5 flights, Betsy and Lady Marad came into view. They were standing outside my grandmother's bedroom door. Now I did venture a glance at Will. What? I mouthed. Will shrugged, perplexed. Trying not to make a sound, we crouched on the stairs and peered down at them through the banister post. You wanted to shout it from the rooftops? Hissed Lady Marehead. She had drawn herself up to her full height in front of Betsy and was glaring at her. Betsy, who was standing with her back to us, shook her head vehemently. No, I thought that if everyone thought nonsense, we'd agreed, had we not? Besides, I don't like the way you talk about my granddaughter. She's reckless, Betsy retorted. She is a book jumper like you, and she's talented. She's sticking her nose in where it's not wanted. Enough, Betsy snorted. It's not as if I enjoy doing favors for our Linux, she said sharply. I gasped in surprise as she continued. And we're not out of the woods yet. What if she finds out? Lady Mare had suddenly lifted her hand and signaled to Betsy to be quiet. She looked up. Will and I pressed deeper into the shadows. I thought I heard something come. My grandmother pushed Betsy into her room and disappeared after her. The door closed behind them, and we heard the sound of a key being turned. It's almost as if the two of them had something to hide, I whispered. I told you we need to keep an eye on Betsy, Will grimaced. And perhaps on Lady Mare, too, I thought. That night Will had a strange dream. He was back in Baker Street, in Sherlock's study, and the darkness was thick outside the window. But Will took up the magnifying glass from the desk anyway, the way he often had as a child. His hand fastened around the smooth, familiar handle. He turned the lens away, this way and that, and although there was no sunlight, a fairy fleck appeared on the white stucco ceiling. It was a big, bright fleck, green and red and glowing. It was Amy. Amy in her green fairy dress. Her long hair fell shining over her shoulders and down her back, and her eyes sparkled. She floated just below the ceiling as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She smiled, and at the same time she looked afraid. What's wrong? Asked Will. What are you afraid of? I won't let you fall. The fairy Amy didn't answer. Her tulle skirt brushed the chandelier. She wants to be invisible, said Betsy. Will turned around and saw Betsy in one of the two armchairs by the fireplace. She was wearing a long hooded cloak and stroking the hound of the Baskervilles' head. It is a great honor to belong to the McAllister clan, she declared. A great honor. You must forget Amy. Will sniffed. She needs my help. He carried on turning the magnifying glass this way and that, and now Amy went floating along the walls. She paddled with her arms like a swimmer to propel herself forward. Amy and the book world, both of them, said Will. Betsy drew her hood over her face so that the shadows fell across her features. Now I'm invisible, too. Will was about to tell her that he could still see her, but at that moment the door opened and Holmes came in. He was wearing his checked suit and his pipe in his mouth. What's that? He cocked his chin in Amy's direction. She was currently gliding up on one of the heavy curtains. Will raised the magnifying glass. Nothing, just a fairy fleck, he said. Like before. Like before? Asked Holmes, dropping onto the second armchair. Suddenly his suit was wet and there was seaweed in his hair. Nothing is like it was before, said Holmes, his voice a hoarse rattle. He looked pale and bloated. Nothing at all. What's happened? Asked Will. Don't you feel well? But at that moment, without a sound, the great detective's eyes grew sightless. They stopped moving, stared blankly into space. Then Will saw the blood. The carpet was soaked with it, thick and heavy and red. The blood was everywhere. It flowed from Holmes' chest, for there was a hole there where no hole should have been. It flowed over Holmes' stomach and thighs and dripped from his knees. And in the hole in his chest was a dagger, cold and silver, with jewels glittering at its hilt. Will dropped the magnifying glass, and it landed with a squelching sound on the wet carpet. Blood spattered up Will's ankles. The monster, somebody whispered. The monster! Will spun around, but he didn't know where the words were coming from. Betsy's face was still in shadow. And Amy? The fairy fleck by the ceiling had disappeared. The night crept closer to the monster, softly, softly. "11. The Child on the Moor. I was going to get you to count the monkeys in the Jungle Book today, to check if they're all still there and in good health. Glenn informed me at the beginning of our lesson the next morning, but I suppose I may as well save myself the trouble. You wouldn't do as you were told anyway. It sounded more like an observation than a reproach. Glenn's scarred face was completely deadpan, and the expression in his good eye was impossible to read. It was hard to tell whether he now approved of my hunt for the thief or whether he still thought I was imagining things. "Off you go, then, and jump," he said at last to Betsy and me, and we did. As Will examined the broken archway and the stone circle, Betsy disappeared as usual into her collection of fairy tales. I landed shortly afterward in the Jungle Book, where Shere Khan told me that unfortunately Werther would be unable to accompany me today. Apparently he'd been neglecting some of his duties in the book world and needed to spend the day attending to them. Falling in unrequited love, for example, and committing suicide, that sort of thing. So the tiger and I set off alone. We spent the whole morning trawling Don Quixote. In the afternoon I jumped from my bedroom and we investigated one of Shakespeare's sonnets, and between times we went to the margin to see if there were any more rumors doing the rounds about missing ideas, but to no avail. Either the thief had got a lot cannier recently, or he or she was taking a break from stealing. It wasn't until late in the evening that I crawled into bed back into the outside world, feeling very frustrated. I had planned to jump once more before going to sleep, but I suddenly got the feeling that it probably wouldn't do any good. Even if the thief did strike again, it was pretty unlikely that I'd be in exactly the right story at exactly right time. Since the previous day, however, I'd been more determined than ever to stop the thief. Once Will had said they'd help me, I'd even thought it would be easy for some reason. But of course there wasn't actually a lot Will could do if he kept refusing to jump, was there? I tossed and turned for some time. It was already midnight when it occurred to me that at last there was something I could do. I groaned aloud with frustration and clapped a hand to my forehead. The solution was so simple, I couldn't believe I hadn't thought of it before. I slipped on my jacket and shoes and tiptoed through the corridors of Lydick's house. The front door creaked softly as I opened it a crack and squeezed out. But inside the house all remained quiet. I hurried across the grounds, the square-trimmed hedges observing me silently. Then I stepped out into the moor. The moon was a thin crescent in the sky, casting a ghostly gleam over the grass and bushes. The night air blew cold through my thoughts. Its scent was a mixture of damp and musty earth and sea salt. From far away came the rumble of the waves as they broke in their cliffs. Beneath my feet the moor made sucking sounds with every step I took. They sounded like little sighs, as if the ground was disappointed at having to let me go again. But nothing was going to stand in my way tonight because I had a plan. And the more I thought about it, the more brilliant this plan seemed. Simple, but brilliant. By the time I arrived at Will's cottage half an hour later, I'd almost forgotten my frustration. I had to knock several times before I heard movement inside the cottage, and I shifted impatiently from one foot to the other. There was a clatter on the other side of the door as if a chair had been knocked over. At last a light appeared in the dirty windows. Will opened the door. He had a t-shirt and boxer shorts on, and his hair was sticking up even more wildly than usual. He was wearing one old sock and holding the other in his hand. He blinked guardedly at me. "Amy," he whispered, "what's going on?" "I have an idea," I explained. This time I was the one who couldn't take my eyes off him. "Could it not have waited until tomorrow?" asked Will, pulling on his other sock. I shook my head. "You wanted to help me, didn't you? Then come with me. We're going to catch Betsy in the act." Will frowned. "Look, if you think you don't have to jump," I said quickly. "But you do need to put on something a bit warmer." I pointed to his bare legs and felt my face turn red. Will grinned and looked for a moment, though he wanted to say something back, and in the end just nodded and disappeared back into the cottage. I waited outside, gnawing at my lower lip, until Will, fully clothed now, eventually reappeared in the doorway. "Will I do?" he asked, giving me a twirl. We set out for the stone circle, which towered silent and deserted on this hilltop above us as we approached. We hunkered down between two bushes from which we had a good view of the portal to the book world, but couldn't be seen ourselves. And then we waited a long time. At first we didn't say a word, and we looked warily in all directions at the slightest sound. But as time went on, and the night grew colder and darker and eerier, my feet went numb and I started shivering. Will gave me a sweater, and we huddled a little closer together. "I'm sure she'll be here soon," I said through chattering teeth. Will put his head in his hands. "I still can't imagine Betsy jumping in secret. And certainly not stealing ideas. I mean, why would she do that? Why would anyone steal ideas from books?" I shot back. Yes, okay, the whole idea is absurd, but Betsy, we grew up together. I've known her practically my whole life. It's true she can be a bit abrasive sometimes, and she's not particularly fond of you, but she loves literature. She's a book jumper through and through. Why do you suspect her of all people? I sighed. It's just that there aren't very many book jumpers, and if it is somebody from Stormsay, perhaps it's some megalomaniac book character. Shere Khan says the thief smells of our island, and besides, we know there's somebody using the portal at night. And the thing with Lady Mara last night on the staircase, that was pretty weird, no? Will sighed. Betsy has no motive. I wrinkled my nose grudgingly, because on that point at least I had to admit he was right. Betsy didn't have a motive, none that I could think of at least. There were tracks around the broken archway, by the way, said Will. I think someone uses some kind of lever to roll that rock down the hill. I eyed the archway's two remaining stone slabs. They looked incredibly heavy. These boulders had resisted centuries of wind and weather. Do you think Betsy would be strong enough to move one of those things? Will snorted. Okay, okay, I decided to drop the subject for the time being and snuggle deeper into Will's sweater, which smelled lovely, of sea salty air and Will's laundry shop. We gazed at the starry sky overhead, millions upon millions of little dots glittering up there in the darkness. I tried not to think about how close together Will and I were sitting. Our shoulders touched, my knee rested on his thigh, and I noticed Will looking at my hair from time to time when he thought I wasn't looking. I saw somebody creeping around the grounds of Lennox's house the other night, by the way, I said at last. The silence was making me nervous all of a sudden. Will looked at me. Somebody in a hooded cloak? I shrugged. I went down to have a look, but it was just Brock. Brock? Counting the gravel stones on our path. Brock is definitely strong enough to have moved one of those boulders, and Brock is a foundling, I frowned. What if he hadn't come from very far away at all? What if his mother or father belonged to one of the clans, and had abandoned him? Was that too far-fetched? Might he have... I began, but Will put a finger to his lips. With the other hand he pointed to one of the bushes on the opposite side of the stone circle. There was something moving there, something human. A figure slipped out of the shadows and between two of the stone archways. She was wearing a long robe, and her hair fell like a curtain across her face. She was small. She was not Betsy. Facing away from us now, she crouched beneath one of the gateways. In her hands she held something barely any longer than a finger. It looked like a part of the spine of an ancient book. Will and I stood up. We moved slightly toward the figure. Not until we were standing directly behind her did Will clear his throat. She turned around. Her face was narrow, her nose pointed, and her long dirty hair came down to her hips. There were leaves and bits of moss tangled in it, and as she hastily stuffed the object she had been holding into a bag, I saw that her hands weren't even half the size of mine. It was a little girl. A little girl staring at us, eyes wide. For the length of a heartbeat, we looked at one another, bewildered. Who was this girl? Where had she come from? What was she doing here in the middle of the night? But before I could even ask one of those questions, the child recovered from a shocked paralysis, turned on her heel, and bolted. Ducking and diving like a fleeing rabbit, she sped down the hill and out onto the moor. We sprinted after her. The girl was nimble, zigzagging this way and that, but we kept her in our sights. I ran as fast as I could, so fast I could hear my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. Eventually, though, I fell behind Will and the child. The moor was vast, but the farther I ran, the more familiar the bushes and pathways became. Will's cottage soon emerged from the darkness. As I approached, I could see that Will had managed to grab hold of the child by the upper arm and was attempting to maneuver her through the door. The three of us stumbled inside the cottage. Will shut the door behind us. I switched on the light and was shocked by what I saw. The child was standing in the middle of the room, looking around as if hoping to find an open window to escape through. Outside in the moonlight, I'd hardly been able to see a thing, but now I saw that the child was skin and bone, and much dirtier than I'd first imagined. Her skin was covered with dried mud and stretched tight over the sharp cheekbones. Her blue eyes were set deep in their sockets, and the color of her dress was faded beyond recognition. It was threadbare and stained so full of holes that the child's skinny body showed through the fabric. Her ribs stuck out too much. The hem of her dress was soaked with mud, which was dripping off into the floor. The child seemed to sense that she was trapped, and after a while she stopped looking around for an escape route. Instead, she turned her eyes on us and pursed her lips defiantly. Don't be scared, I said. We won't hurt you. Who are you? What's your name? Asked Will. She didn't answer. She dug her bare blackened toes into the rug without a word. How did you get to Stormsay? How old are you? What happened to you? The little girl turned away and started wandering around the room. She ran her tiny hand over the sofa upholstery, and then spotted a loaf of bread and a jar of jam on the shelf by the window and reached out to grab them. Are you hungry? I asked. The child fished out a slice of bread and tried to open the jam jar, but the lid was on too tight. Will took the jam of the loaf from her and started making a sandwich. The child stood on tiptoe and rocked forward and backward spellbound, watching his every move. No sooner had he spread the first slice than she snatched it out of his hands and bit into it. She wolfed it down in a matter of seconds. "I'll take that as a yes," said Will, spreading jam on another slice of bread. "Perhaps she can't understand us," I mused. Will shrugged. "Hello, my name is Amy," I tried in German, as the little girl polished off her second slice, but to no avail. We tried again in French, Spanish, Gaelic, respectively, but none of them drew any response from the child. She gobbled up half the loaf in record time, then curled up on the sofa and instantly fell asleep. Will draped a woolen blanket over the tiny body, and then we sat down by the stove and pondered. For a while the only sound was the crackle of flames and the quiet bubbling of a stove at our backs, mingling with the child's snores. At last, however, we began to speak in whispers. "Who is she? Where does she come from?" I asked. "Do you think she got washed ashore too?" Will put his head to one side. "Maybe, but look at her clothes. She must have been living out here on the moor for quite a while, perhaps in one of the caves to the north of the island." I looked at the child's gaunt face. "But who is she?" She's a kid. She can't be more than about 9. How did she get here?" "Why would she hide?" "No idea." The snores grew louder. The little girl rolled onto her stomach in her sleep, leaving one of her little arms dangling off the sofa. I gnawed at my lower lip. I ventured at last, might she have come from the book world? Perhaps Betsy brought her here, and now she doesn't want to go back. And if she was a book character, don't you think she'd prefer to jump back to her story rather than starve to death here?" I said. "She seems frightened of something anyway." Will put more wood on the stove. I rested my chin on my knees, which were drawn up to close to my chest, and let the fire warm the back of my neck. I was lulled by the child's steady snores. Will's voice washed over me, saying something about a figure on the moor and a monster. Had he really just said monster? I was about to ask him what he meant when my eyes fell shut. I was woken by my own shivering. The first thing I saw when I opened my eyes, blinking in the gray morning light, was the underside of the coffee table. My back hurt. I'd fallen asleep in my chair and must have slid down onto the floor during the night and slept at a funny angle. Groaning, I struggled to my feet and realized the reason I was so cold was not only that the stove had gone out, but that a chill wind was blowing through the cottage. The door Will had locked the night before was wide open. The sofa was empty. I turned and saw Will lying close by. He too had spent the night on the floor and was still fast asleep. The child, however, had vanished. I was by the door in a flash. The key was in the lock. The child must have pilfered it from Will's trouser pocket. "What's the matter?" asked Will drowsily. "She's gone," I called, rushing outside, but the child was nowhere to be seen. "Gone," said Will, stepping outside to join me. I nodded. The sky was blue, and the wisps of fog hung over the moor, gradually dispersing as the sun rose higher. Dewdrops glistened wherever a ray of sunlight had managed to pierce the mist. The summer morning smelled so fresh and new and peaceful that the memory of the darkness and the mute child suddenly felt unreal. Had there really ever been a dirty little girl roaming the island, or had the thin form of the sofa been a dream all along? I would have liked to believe that, but the footprints in the damp earth leading away from the cottage told a different story. The child on the moor continued to haunt my thoughts as I tiptoed along the corridors of Lennox's house. Who was the little girl? What had she been doing at the stone circle? I could almost hear my questions reverberating through the silent mansion, but I was being ridiculous, of course. Nobody could hear me. It was Saturday morning, after all, and only 7 o'clock. Everyone would still be asleep, which is a good thing, too, since I didn't really feel like explaining where I'd been all night. I crept hurriedly up the stairs to my room, looking forward to my soft, warm bed. I would close the curtains and pull the covers up over my head and treat myself to a nice song to lie in. My plan was to have breakfast at about midday, after I'd had a nap. Then later I might go and see Will, and we could look for the child together. Something inside me rejoiced at this thought, and a kind of warmth spread through my chest, a warmth that fascinated and scared me at the same time. Or was it just tiredness? I reached my bedroom door and had just laid a hand on the doorknob when I heard a footsteps beside me. "Oh, excellent, you're already up," cried Alexis, climbing the stairs toward me with a jam sandwich in her hand. "I was just coming to wake you up." "What?" I said. "Why? It's Saturday, isn't it?" "Exactly," Alexis beamed at me. I raised my eyebrows. Was I missing something? Alexis looked at her watch and murmured, "Perfect, perfect. This means we can get going straight away. Go grab your jacket and I'll wait for you here, okay?" "What is that baggy old sweater you've got on?" I said. I realized I was still wearing Will's sweater. I know you like baggy clothes, but you couldn't have found anything more shapeless if you tried, could you? I shook my head. Alexis, seemingly unable to wait any longer, charged past me into my room and without any further ado, fetched my jacket herself. 5 seconds later, and she was already hustling me down the stairs. So where are we going? I suppressed a yawn. We're having a day out, Alexis explained. We're going to Lerwick. I've already arranged the whole thing as a surprise. Aren't you excited? Lerwick, I asked. Isn't that on mainland? How are we going to get there? By boat, of course, Alexis laughed. What was she so chirpy about all of a sudden? She practically dragged me down the stairs I'd just climbed minutes earlier, bundled me through the huge front door, and ushered me across the grounds. We arrived in the village at a run, and hurried past Finley's shop. Brock was sitting on the steps outside his house again. He was counting princesses today, he told us as he wished him good morning. Alexis was number 1 and I was number 2. He'll probably count us again on the way back, said Alexis with amusement. What time will we be back? I asked, thinking longingly on my four-poster bed. Alexis didn't answer. The jetty was in sight now, and she was waving to somebody in a little motor boat. At first I thought it was a ferryman who had brought us to the island when we first arrived, but then I noticed the blonde hair and the youthful physique. It was Desmond. He'd swapped his monk's robes for jeans and a checked shirt, and grinned as we clambered into the bobbing boat beside him. I swallowed hard. It had just dawned on me that I was going to be spending the day with 2 lovebirds, who, however unbelievable it seems to me, also happened to be my parents. Alexis and Desmond greeted each other with a kiss while I pretended to be picking a bit of fluff from my sleeve. Then Desmond started the motor, and Alexis burbled something about our first ever family outing together. The boat glided out into the open sea, which was far more kindly disposed toward us today than it had been the last time. The water was clearer than I would have expected in these latitudes, and sparkled in the sunlight. If it hadn't been for the cool breeze that played around our faces and tugged at our hair, we could have been forgiven for thinking we were somewhere in the tropics. The journey to mainland took about 2 hours, and the farther we got from our island, the less I thought about the child on the moor. The memory of her skinny, dirty body faded with every mile we put between ourselves and Stormsay. Lerwick Harbor, where we eventually moored the boat, was small, as was the town itself, but after weeks on Stormsay it felt like a buzzing metropolis. There were people everywhere, and shops and supermarkets and cafes and a bank. Lerwick is tiny in comparison to Bochum, but it felt almost hectic to us now. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed this hectic pace of life. Alexis and I plunged into the colorful hustle and bustle, browsing the shop windows and watching the passers-by. Only Desmond looked uncertain, surrounded by all these people. He held Alexis's hand and jumped whenever somebody went by on a motorbike or a baby started crying. I haven't been here for nearly 100 years, he said quietly, his eyes glued to a shop window full of plasma TVs. Well then, it's about time, said Alexis, with a sideways smile at him. 10 minutes later, we were standing in a clothes shop, with Alexis pulling one brightly colored sweater after another off a pile and holding them up against me. This one is Scottish lamb's wool, she told me. That'll keep you warm. I sighed and nodded, having already realized that she would not rest until she had purchased me a particularly flamboyant specimen. I resolved never to wear it. Desmond seemed to have opted for the same strategy when she thrust a plastic bag containing a bright yellow raincoat at him. He merely muttered something about his monk's robes, which were apparently very waterproof, and took the bag from her anyway. Around noon we went to a bookshop in which perfectly ordinary people were buying perfectly ordinary books to read in a perfectly ordinary way. In the children's section I spotted an illustrated edition of The Jungle Book, and suddenly Stormsay in the book world felt like a dream. A lovely dream, from which it would hurt to wake up. I turned away from the children's books. Alexis was buying a new vegan cookbook. Desmond had stopped by a shelf of volumes of medieval poetry and was gazing at them wistfully. An elderly lady, meanwhile, was waving a copy of Pride and Prejudice around under one of the shop assistants' noses. She declared furiously that the story was not as she remembered it, and that Elizabeth Bennet's broken leg was an outrage. I gulped. Okay, said Alexis, returning from the till and pulling out a shopping list. Now the health food shop? Desmond was still looking at the poetry books and didn't seem to have heard her. I yawned. Or a coffee, I suggested. I was so tired by now that I reckoned a sizable dose of caffeine was the only thing that was going to stop me falling asleep on the spot. Alexis nodded. Let's split up, then. So while Alexis set off in the search of biodegradable shampoo and vegan sandwich paste, Desmond and I sat down outside A tiny red building with a stepped gable had a tiny round table. I ordered us 2 cups of coffee and a double espresso, which I downed straight away. There was a busker standing outside the building opposite, playing a jazz piece on the saxophone. It was the music that finally brought Desmond out of his reverie. He smiled suddenly. "Your mother and I danced to this song on her 16th birthday," he said. "Really?" In my mind's eye, a younger version of Alexis whirled around and around in Desmond's arms. Her red hair flew out behind her. They were both laughing. Desmond nodded and looked as though the same film reel was playing in his head, but his smile quickly gave way to a bitter expression. Was it really the age difference that had kept him and Alexis apart, or something else? I remembered the look on his face just now in the bookshop. "Do you find it really difficult being here?" He cleared his throat. "Well, I'm not used to so many people. That's not what I meant." Desmond cupped his chin in his hands and hesitated for a moment. "I don't belong in the outside world," he said slowly. "I don't fit in here, and that will never change, but You still like being here?" "No, but I have come to terms with what's happened." He stared down at his coffee. "And I'm thankful for having had the chance to meet Alexis. She is the love of my life. You're very like her, by the way." I snorted. "As if." "Yes, really." He looked at me. The corners of his mouth twitched once or twice before he spoke again, as if he was wondering whether to say what he was thinking. "In the book world, I never would have had the chance to be a father," he murmured at last. "I honestly can't believe I have a wonderful daughter like you." I looked down but felt something swell in my chest. However strange the circumstances, it felt good to have a father. The jazz musician went around with a hat, and Desmond dropped in a few coins as he came past our table. "Some characters in the book world have children, though," I said, thinking of Mr. and Miss Bennet and their 5 daughters. "Of course," said Desmond, "if the story dictates it." "And your story didn't?" "No. You were a knight." "Yes. Were you happy?" He sighed. "Yes and no. I managed to defeat the monster, but the way it happened was—" He closed his eyes for a moment. "In the story, the knight had to die at the end, and it was not a good death," he explained haltingly. The cup clinked, and I set it down a little too violently in its saucer. "Did you get killed?" I whispered. Desmond didn't answer. Instead, he drained the last of his coffee, sprang to his feet, and beckoned to Alexis, who was crossing the road toward us with 2 large shopping bags. She was a bit out of breath when she arrived, and she beamed and flopped down on the chair between us. "Do you remember?" she asked Desmond, nodding in the direction of the busker, who appeared to have a rather limited repertoire and was playing the same song over again. Desmond nodded. "How could I forget?" When he finally came face to face with the monster, he did not realize it at first. When he saw, it made no sense. Or did it? A pearl of recognition formed in his mind. He was afraid. Then he reached for his weapon. 12. A Midwinter Night's Dream. In the nights that followed, Will and I kept watch at the stone circle again several times, but nobody, not even the child, materialized. This gave us plenty of time to talk. We discussed our favorite books in whispers, and the more time went on, the more often our hands touched as if by accident. Or was I just imagining things? But then, a few days later, the thief struck again. In broad daylight this time, Morther and I heard the news in the margin one day during one of my jumping lessons. We'd just been in Heroes Direct talking to Hercules, who was being fitted for a new pair of sandals, about how things were going in the classical dramas, and he'd assured us that everything was fine. There was still no shortage of tragic demises, so all was as it should be. We stepped out onto the street, however. A large translucent thing came whooshing through the air toward us. We managed to jump aside just in time, narrowly avoiding being flattened by the creature as it went hurtling past us in the direction of the ink pot. It was as tall as a house, and its lower body consisted not of legs but of a weird plume of smoke. At the end of this plume of smoke hung a dented oil lamp which clattered along the ground behind it. "The thief!" thundered the genie in an Arabian accent. "He has robbed the Sultan! Gold and jewels from his treasure chamber! An outrage!" My heart beat faster. "Excuse me, to which Sultan are you referring?" asked Werther. But the genie had already gone sailing past us. Luckily, I knew which story he came from. "Aladdin," I said tersely to Werther, tugging at his arm. At last we had a clue. We had to get to the Arabian Nights, ASAP. Unfortunately, however, Werther wouldn't budge, no matter how much I tugged at the sleeve of his frilled shirt. Instead, he stood with his back pressed against the window of the hero's direct and closed his eyes. All the color drained from his face. "Not again," he breathed. "What's wrong?" I asked, still trying to drag him along the road. "Come on, we have to hurry. We still might catch the thief." Werther didn't move an inch. He was trembling now. "Something wicked this way, crumbs," he croaked. "Pardon?" I exclaimed. "What do you mean, something wicked?" Then I too noticed the flapping sound that filled the air. It was the flap of ragged hooded cloaks, a dark restless sound, the kind that signals of an impending thunderstorm. A moment later, the three old women I had found tormenting Werther on my first ever visit to the book world came swooping down out of the sky. I knew by now that they were the witches from Macbeth. They swirled to the streets, shrieking, leaving the stench of decay in their wake. "Alas!" they wailed. "Alas, it doth snow in a midsummer night's dream." "What's that supposed to mean?" I cried. The witches turned to look at me. "Sisters, 'tis the impudent reader," said the first witch, jabbing a long fingernail in my direction, and young Werther, leered the second. Her warty nose quivered with pleasure at the sight of her favorite victim. "Hail to thee, young Werther," screeched the third, grinning. "Thou shalt wed her so that by and by." Werther slumped to the ground and hid his head in his hands. "Begone," he muttered almost inaudibly. "Thou shalt find happiness with the first witch began, but I cut her off. "What happened? Is there a problem in a midsummer night's dream?" I called. The unnatural fluttering of the witch's cloaks fell silent. "'Twas the base thief," explained the third witch, and her shoulders drooped. The grin faded from her face. "Nothing is sacred to him, not even the works of the great Shakespeare. Now he hath stolen summer itself." "Alas!" wailed the other two witches. "Alas, it doth snow in a midsummer night's dream." "But I thought Betsy had only just stolen from a sultan and Aladdin and the magic lamp," I murmured. "How can that be?" "She can't have been at two places at once, can she?" "Alas, this is like to be the blackest magic," screeched the witches, rolling their eyes in fear, "blacker even than our own." "Black magic?" I raised my eyebrows. I believed in many things by this point, but magic certainly wasn't one of them. "Well, I don't know. What do you think?" I said, turning to Werther. But Werther didn't answer because he'd fainted. This seemed to cheer the witches enormously. Leering, they dangled their witchy hair into his face and scraped their fingernails down the window pane beside his ear before flying away. Even after I'd shaken Werther awake, dragged him inside the ink pot, and packed him up with a glass of cola, I still couldn't make any sense of it all. At first I wondered whether Betsy might have gone on in a kind of thieving spree, stealing from several stories in quick succession. But both the genie and the witches, when they'd arrived at the pub, had repeatedly assured everyone at the bar that they'd come straight there after their robberies to raise the alarm. And all the book characters present agreed that nobody could flick through literature that fast. Not from the Arabian Nights to Shakespeare, at any rate. By the time I finally jumped back to the outside world, I still didn't know who was behind the thefts or how to stop them. But I was very conscious of the fact that I was going to need more help in the book world, help that was less prone to fainting fits than Werther. Will was still sitting in the grass beside one of the boulders in the stone circle, reading in the traditional sense Peter Pan. He was so absorbed in the story that he didn't even look up until I was standing right in front of him. "I'm back," I announced superfluously, nodding at the book of fairy tales lying on a mat under one of the archways. "I take it Betsy's still inside her book." Will nodded absent-mindedly. His mind, it seemed, was still worrying with thoughts of Neverland. "Good," I murmured, pacing up and down the stone circle. It was 11 o'clock. We still had an hour until Glenn came to fetch us back to the library for a lesson on literary history. Now that clues had started appearing again as to the identity of the thief, who might be wreaking havoc in the book world even now, it was obvious what we'd had to do. Without stopping to think, I marched back over to Will, grabbed him by the elbow, and pulled him to his feet. "Come on," I said brusquely. He blinked. "What? Where?" "It's snowing in a midsummer night's dream," I said. "The thief was struck twice already today." I opened up the Jungle Book and tried to maneuver Will toward one of the gateways, but he stayed rooted to the spot. "What?" "What do you think? We have to try, and we have to go now." Will folded his arms. "I'm not jumping again, Amy," he said quietly. "But you have to. I need your help." I lay down under the portal. He sighed. Not like this, though. I don't want to do any more damage. Holmes, enough about Holmes. Come on, I said, patting the map beside me. Please, it's for the book world. After all. I'm not jumping again, Will repeated. I've made my decision. You can't stop jumping, Will. We have to stop Betsy. We have to. How could he not understand that? A knot of anger tightened in my stomach. But I still don't think Betsy effing H, I shouted. Then it's somebody else, Will. Whoever the thief is, or for whatever reason he or she is stealing ideas, it's destroying literature. Doesn't the book world mean anything to you? All the stories we love? What if Peter Pan is next? Will's jaw tightened. He gripped his favorite book so hard his knuckles went white. You can't just stand by and watch, Will. That's not what Holmes would have wanted, is it? I looked him straight in the eye. He was silent. 3 seagulls were circling overhead. Their screeches were not unlike those of the witches, only quieter and less piercing, as if the 3 old women were calling to us for help from far away. Will tipped his head back and looked as if the flying gulls without really seeing them. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere beyond the clouds. I could see him searching his soul, wrestling with himself. The roar of the waves that drifted up to us from the shoreline sounded like the storm of thoughts inside his head. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Will took a very deep breath and sighed. No, he said at last, his voice firm. You're right. Holmes would have wanted us to catch the thief. Holmes never lets a criminal get away. He sighed. But I'll only jump until we've caught him. After that, I nodded and moved over a little to make space for Will beside me. For a moment, the sky looked higher and wider than it ever had before. As we lay there shoulder to shoulder, then I slid the Jungle Book over our faces. We found Werther exactly where I'd left him, at the bar of the ink pot. In front of him were several empty cola bottles, and he was rocking restlessly back and forth on his bar stool. Possibly because there was now more caffeine and sugar running through his veins than actual blood. How had he managed to drink so much in the short time I'd been away? Hello, Miss Amy, he greeted me chirpily. His eyes lit up. Well, when he saw Will standing beside me, his smile stiffened a little. Will McAllister, said Will, holding out his hand. Pleased to meet you. Likewise, said Werther, clearing his throat. Yes, indeed, very pleased. I've decided to go and look for clues in A Midsummer Night's Dream, I explained. Werther nodded. I shall accompany you, of course, as long as our route does not take us through Macbeth. That play does not seem to agree with me, as you know. He tried to sound nonchalant, but his fear of the witches was written all over his face. Good, let's go then, shall we? Asked Will. I know a shortcut, by the way. We won't even have to go near certain witches' grave. Werther studied Will with a mixture of relief and disappointment. I take it the young gentleman is to accompany us? He inquired. I nodded. He's a book jumper like me. He'll be helping us from now on. Aha, said Werther, straightening the ribbon in his hair. Well then. Will led us out of the pub straight down to the margin, and then with the precision of a sleepwalker through an astounding number of Shakespeare plays. At first I marveled at Will's purposefulness, but it shouldn't really have surprised me. Will was a much more experienced book jumper than I was. He had years of training behind him. Of course he knew his way around the book world. And now that he decided to jump again, now that he'd realized he had no choice, if we were to save the book world, he was showing the same fierce determination as when he'd refused to set foot in it ever again. So Werther and I followed Will through the Italian city, states and British fields until we came to a mountain range, at the foot of which lay a Mediterranean-looking city. The sun was setting on the horizon, blood-red, bathing olive groves and ancient temples in a warm glow. Unfortunately, nothing else about the place was warm. It was snowing, in fact. The roofs of the houses and towers looked as though they had been coated with white icing, and frost glittered on the ancient marble columns. Is this Athens? Asked Werther, pulling his velvet waistcoat more tightly around him. Yes, said Will, this is it. He flicked us through the pages, through the snowflakes that fell thicker and faster every minute, to one of the gates in the city hall. At that moment a pair of lovers slipped out into the night and ran off into a nearby wood. They were both too scantily clad for the wintry conditions. What's A Midsummer Night's Dream about? I asked. Will shrugged. It's about love and fairy magic, he said. Lysander and Hermia are in love, but they can't be together because Hermia's dad wants her to marry Demetrius. So she runs away from Athens with Lysander. Then there's a character called Helena who's in love with Demetrius and wants him for herself. She tells Demetrius about Hermia and Lysander's plan to run away together, and Demetrius goes after him, and then Helena follows Demetrius, and they all end up in the woods. The fairies cast spells on them and make both the men temporarily fall in love with Helena, so they suddenly forget about Hermia. Oh yeah, and there's a weaver whose head gets turned into a donkey's head. The whole thing is pretty confusing, he explained as another young man came running out of the city into the woods, followed by a young woman. Hermia is promised to another? Is it about unrequited love? Stammered Werther. Is it about fairies? I asked. Will nodded. But the story usually takes place on a warm summer night, so someone must have stolen the idea of it being summer. He folded his arms for a moment and pondered. I half expected him to pull a magnifying glass out of his pocket, or at least a pipe to chew on, but he didn't, of course. He just pointed to the edge of the wood and murmured, Let's see if there are any witnesses. Perhaps someone will be able to identify the thief, or at least give us something to go on. We left the city behind and trudged off after the four lovesick characters. There was no easy task, however, since we were now ankle deep in snow. We made slow progress. My sneakers were soon soaked through, and my toes were numb with cold. Will lent me a sweater again, while Werther's teeth chattered so loudly that the whole of the forest must have heard them. There was no sign of the lovers. Instead, the trees began to thin out and eventually gave way to a clearing full of dancing fairies with butterfly wings sprouting from their backs, dressed in clothes made of flower petals. It would probably have looked quite magical if the delicate little creatures hadn't been shivering so violently. They weren't so much dancing, in fact, as hopping and rubbing one another's wings to warm them up. Their bare feet had turned completely blue, and they were crying ice crystals instead of tears. Icicles of snot hung from their noses. Our poor queen, they cried. If we could but light a fire for her. At the center of the clearing hung a sort of hammock lined with moss, and in it lay a fairy wearing a dress of shimmering cobwebs and a crown of pine cones. Her long golden hair was draped over her shoulders like a cloak. She too was shivering. Beside her perched a fairy with impish face, twirling a flower between his fingers. Tatiana, Will greeted the fairy queen. Tatiana's eyes fluttered open reluctantly. Who are you? She breathed. My name is Werther, said Werther with a bow. Amy and I are readers. We're looking for the thief who has stolen the summer from you. Have you noticed anything out of the ordinary today? The fairy queen rose from her bed of moss and floated over to us. Frozen dewdrops glittered on her eyelashes. Her eyes were far too large and far too blue to be human. No, she said, her voice as clear as a bell. No, all is as it should be. Peas blossom and mustard seed did dress my hair, when all of a sudden it turned cold, terribly cold. Then at last the frozen water fell from the heavens, and now we can no longer sleep for shivering. The story cannot go on. She floated very close to Will, circled around him, and brushed his cheek with her delicate fairy fingers. So thou art a reader? She murmured. I cleared my throat. Why can't the story go on? The fairy queen shot a glance at me. My husband Oberon must anoint my eyelids with the juice of this flower, fetched here by Puck, she explained, pointing to the fairy with an impish face. The flower's liquor must enchant me so that when I wake, I fall in love with the donkey-headed weaver who will still be here anon. But if I do not fall asleep, the magic cannot work. Lysander and Demetrius do likewise fear to lay them down to sleep, said Puck. They fear to freeze to death, but I must drop the juice of the flower into their eyes, too, so they may fall in love with Helena. But if you lot can do magic, can't you just make it a bit warmer? I asked. Puck shook his head. The only spells we have the power to cast are the spells we use in our play. And aren't there any of those that we might help? I asked. Puck and the fairy queen looked at each other. Well, said Titiana, perchance the fog. The fog? Asked Puck. Fog is warmer than snow, at least, she batted her glittering eyelashes. Puck furrowed his brow and then nodded and started murmuring something about dark fogs. Covered stars in a veil of night. It stopped snowing instantly. The sky grew darker and then darker still. Swaths of murky cloud descended on the clearing and swallowed up the figures of the fairy queen and her subjects. Can't you conjure like a see-through fog or something? I asked Puck, but he too had vanished. I heard Werther's teeth chattering somewhere too close by, but I couldn't see him anymore. Werther? I asked. Miss Amy? He replied from a completely different direction to the one I'd been expecting. It also sounded as though he was no longer standing right beside me, but a few yards away, in the tree somewhere. I put out my hands and felt about for Will, who had been standing to my left, but my fingers found nothing but empty air. Will? I called. Will? Werther? Tatiana? Puck? Nobody answered. Mustard seed? I stammered. What was the name of the other fairy Tatiana had mentioned? Pea? I swallowed. Pea soup? Off to my right, somebody giggled. I spun around and stumbled blindly a few paces toward the sound. But it didn't seem to come any closer. The giggling grew fainter and fainter and eventually fell silent. I stood still and listened in the darkness. Perhaps, I thought, the fog swallowed up any sound you made and released it again in a completely different place. Or perhaps I just lost my bearings? Still, at least the fog had thawed the wood out a bit. The temperature is more like autumn than winter now. Wasn't this pitch blackness going to make it difficult for the story to carry on as normal, though? Or was there an end to the darkness somewhere? Was I the only one being left behind in Puck's fog? Wait, what was that? There was something rustling in the bushes behind me, and a snapping noise like somebody snapping on a twig. I groped my way cautiously deeper into the wood. There was somebody breathing in the trees, and I moved slowly toward the sound. Will, I whispered, is that you? I love thee not, Helena, said a man's voice. Follow me no more, or I shall end by killing thee. Better to die by the hand I love than to go back. Now come, Demetrius. Do not make such a fuss. Lay thee down to sleep, that Puck may cast his spell upon you. 'Tis warmer now, a woman's voice replied. Never, Demetrius retorted. My heart belongs to Hermia alone. I do not wish to forget her, nor to freeze to death this night. Here, take thou my kerchief, Helena said with a sigh. From somewhere nearby came the sound of sobbing. Somebody was obviously overcome with emotion at this touching little scene. It sounded suspiciously like Werther. I stumbled onward, trying to get to him, but now the sobs were turned to giggles and produced, unless I was very much mistaken, by Puck. I changed direction angrily and a little too hastily and walked slap bang into a tree. I hit my head on the trunk so hard it sent me staggering backward. Ouch! I gasped, landing on my bum on a particularly solid tree root. I rubbed my forehead and felt a lump swelling rapidly beneath my fingers. Great, and to think I was actually less clumsy in the book world than the outside world, although I'd probably been tempting fate a bit by running through a forest in the pitch dark, to be fair. When I got to my feet again, I felt slightly dizzy. My forehead throbbed, and I groped my way through the darkness even more gingerly now. I couldn't hear Demetrius and Helena anymore, and Puck's giggles had receded too. For a while I walked deeper and deeper into the thicket without hearing a sound. There didn't even seem to be any animals stirring. I felt almost like the only living creature in the whole wood. I wouldn't even have been sure there were trees either side of me if I hadn't been running my fingers over their trunks and branches. I almost tripped a few times over catching my foot on a vine or a tree root, and several times I had to stop to untangle my hair from low-hanging twigs and brambles, but the darkness persisted. I was completely enveloped by Puck's fog. The blackness was thick and impenetrable and showed no sign of lifting as I went on. I'd long since lost all sense of where I was. Was I getting closer to the city? Was I going around in circles? Or was there no longer an end and a beginning? Had the darkness become all-encompassing, omnipresent? I started to feel afraid. Where was I? Where was Will and Werther? Where were all the characters from the play? I tugged frantically at anything I could lay my hands on, ferns, stones, tree branches. If I could only turn pages, take myself somewhere a bit lighter, but no matter how much I tugged and strayed, it was no use. The corners of any of these pages, had I really come so far from any sort of plot? Shouldn't I at least have come to the edge of the play eventually and crossed over to another story? Was there no way out? Panic welled up inside me. A little voice in my head whispered spiteful things. You're lost. You're never going to find your way out of this wood. You're going to die in this fog. No, I thought, standing still and forcing myself to breathe deeply. The darkness wouldn't last forever. Eventually I'd run into one of the others, and together we'd find our way out back. I would get out of this book. I just had to stay calm. Damp, cold forest air filled my lungs, but my heart was still racing. Panic clutched at my throat with a grip like iron, and I couldn't shake it off. And then I saw it all of a sudden in the darkness. It was a blade. The silver blade of a dagger flashed before me. Its bright gleam hurt my eyes. I gasped. The antique weapon was jewel-encrusted and gripped by a pale hand. I couldn't see who it belonged to. Perhaps the wrist disappeared into a black sleeve, or perhaps it was a hand without a body. Floating through the night, one thing was certain. The hand was preparing to strike. The blade glinted in the blackness of the fog, and dagger hummed through the air. Something was driving it toward my chest. Somebody was aiming for my heart. I realized all this within a fraction of a second. I heard myself scream. At the same time, I took a step backward, tripped over a stone, and fell. The blade missed me by millimeters. The back of my head cracked against a tree. I blacked out for a moment. When I came to, the dagger and the pale hand that held it had vanished. I blinked. The blackness was total once more. It surrounded me, heavy and unbroken. I sat there with my back to the tree trunk. My whole body trembled. I listened intently to the darkness. Was I alone again? You are going to die in this wood, whispered the cruel voice in my head. You see? You're going to die just like I said. It's only a matter of time. Tears welled from the corners of my eyes and trickled down my cheeks. I didn't wipe them away. Perhaps it was only a matter of time until the attacker found me and tried again, I thought. Then I heard the footsteps. I knew I had to run, but my body was paralyzed and I couldn't move. A rustling noise nearby. There was somebody there, far too close. I held my breath. Amy? Amy, where are you? Was that you screaming? It was Will's voice, unmistakable. Amy, is everything okay? Will, relief flooded through me, and out I let out my breath. I'm here, I whispered. Amy? Will? The rustling came closer. Will bumped into my shoulder, and his fingers moved tentatively along my hairline over my ear and down to my chin. Why are you crying? Asked Will. I felt him lower himself to the ground beside me. Somebody attacked me, I faltered, with a dagger. What? With a dagger? Are you hurt? No, I managed to get out of the way, and then all of a sudden he was gone. Thank God, said Will. Did you see who it was or where he went? No, I'm just so glad he's gone. Do you know where Werther is? No. I sighed. I hate this fog. I wish Puck would make it stop. That might take a while, said Will. Puck is having way too much fun confusing everybody. Oh, great, I shuddered at the thought of being stuck in this darkness a moment longer. Are you cold? Will put his arm around me. In daylight I'd never have dared, but now I leaned gratefully against him. The darkness seemed to wrap itself more tightly around us, pushing us closer together as if it were trying to shackle us to the tree behind our backs. My breathing gradually slowed as I listened to Will's heartbeat. His t-shirt gave off a smell of moorland and soap. It smelled of storms and a kind of proof that the island did still exist beyond this darkness. And it smelled of Will. I'm so glad not to be stranded here on my own anymore, I murmured into the thin fabric. Me too, said Will. Thank you for opening my eyes. What do you mean? Coming here was the right thing to do. The chaos in this story is unbelievable. We have to do something about it. You are right. I can't keep hiding in the outside world. He shifted his weight a little. Amy? His face was suddenly very close to mine. So close that I felt his breath on my cheek. I felt a flutter in my chest. Yes? I'm really glad you and your mom came to Stormsea, he murmured. Really? Will's reply was soft and warm. It brushed my lips as gently as a butterfly's wing. Miss Amy, Will's reply ended abruptly. Werther, said Will, letting go of me. It was only then I realized I'd had my eyes closed because when I opened them again, the darkness had given way to dusky light. The fog still clung to the grass and ferns in places, but it was starting to recede. I must have gone around in a circle after all, because we were back in the Fairy Queen's clearing, if indeed we had ever left it. There was no sign of the dancing fairies or of Titiana herself, but the hammock with the bed of moss was still there, swinging gently to and fro. In it sat Werther. Loose strands of hair hung down around his face, leaves and twigs tangled up in them. One of the sleeves had come off his frilled shirt, and his silk stockings were in tatters. He scrutinized us, lips pursed, his eyes moving from me to Will and back again. Then he nodded slowly, looking as if he'd just bitten into a lemon. Good to see you again, said Will. Werther's nostrils flared. Well, he said without looking at Will, I've been looking everywhere for you. Miss Amy, anxious to ensure your safety. Are you quite well? Are you wounded? Just a scratch, I prodded the lump on my forehead, which had already started to go down. Where are the fairies? Werther shrugged. No idea, said Will, tipping his head back. It had started snowing again. Thick flakes rained down on us from the sky. The temperature was dropping with every breath we took. Let's get back to the city before Puck conjures up the fog again. Perhaps the summer was stolen right at the beginning of the story, and the characters there can help us. I said, unconvinced. Oh well, if that's the case, at least we won't freeze to death trying to find out. Will stood up and put out a hand to help me to my feet. Werther climbed down the fairy hammock, and we left the enchanted wood. Soon we were passing through the gates of the city of Athens. The princess waited for the night to return. For days on end she waited. Had he forgotten her? feel like I should stop here. And maybe resume a little bit later. Let me see how much. Okay. We'll just read the fourth part later. And that will be the last chapters of it. Merry Christmas. And thank you for listening. I'll read more after a little while. Goodbye for now.